Intelligence is supposed to protect you from error. It's supposed to sharpen your reasoning, refine your judgment, and help you see through deception. But here's the trap: the smarter you are, the more sophisticated your justifications become, and the more convincing your self-deceptions sound. It doesn't start maliciously. High intelligence comes with a heightened ability to detect flaws in other people's arguments, spot contradictions, and construct elegant explanations. But that same mental machinery can be turned inward, used not to search for truth, but to protect the self from dissonance. Intelligence becomes a tool for building justifications rather than dismantling illusions. The smarter the mind, the more capable it is of bending logic to fit pre-existing conclusions. You don't abandon reasoning, you weaponize it. You argue yourself into false confidence. You rationalize failures of perception. You generate airtight arguments in favor of positions you've never truly questioned. Intelligence, in this form, isn't self-correcting. It's self-reinforcing. This is the logic trap. You think you're objective because you're smart. You think you're fair-minded because you can see more angles. But objectivity isn't a byproduct of intelligence. It's a discipline. And the smarter you are, the more discipline you need. Because the better you are at defending a position, the harder it becomes to notice when it's wrong. The mind doesn't crave truth. It craves coherence. It prefers a false narrative that feels right over a true one that feels destabilizing. And when intelligence steps in to maintain that coherence, it doesn't do it through denial, it does it through logic. You don't ignore evidence. You reinterpret it. You don't silence doubt. You out-argue it. You don't abandon reason. You enlist it. This trap has no obvious trigger. You're not consciously lying to yourself. You're not covering up a flaw. You're just explaining, clarifying, reframing, and in the process, you drift further from reality, convinced, all the while, that you're getting closer, because your arguments are consistent, your logic is clean, and your mind is trained. But reasoning is not truth. It's just a process. And when that process becomes a closed loop, fed by the desire to protect your identity, your choices, or your worldview, intelligence becomes a liability. You don't notice the drift because it's smooth. Every step feels correct. There's no friction, no resistance, just the pleasant slide of internal coherence. This is why highly intelligent people can be deeply wrong and still confident. Why some of the most dangerous ideas come from the most articulate minds. Intelligence builds better walls, not better windows. And unless it's constantly forced outward, toward challenge, contradiction, and falsification, it curls inward and becomes a justification engine. You might think intelligence is your safeguard against delusion, but it's just as often the architect of your delusions. And the smarter you are, the more elaborate and convincing those delusions become. You don't need to lie. You just need to think clearly toward the wrong conclusion. Here's what this looks like in practice. You form a belief, maybe from experience, maybe from culture, maybe from bias. Then, instead of rigorously testing that belief, you refine it. You reinforce it with analogies, correlations, historical data, or logical symmetry. You bulletproof the belief with reason. Then forget to ask if it should exist in the first place. You mistake sharpness for accuracy, eloquence for truth, internal consistency for external validity. And that's the second layer of the trap. Other people believe you because your conclusions sound polished. They're supported. They're well articulated. People confuse your verbal strength with logical strength. You become a reference point, and the social validation you receive becomes another piece of evidence, supporting your belief, not challenging it. So the loop grows tighter. Confidence increases. Dissonance shrinks. You become harder to challenge, not because your ideas are better, but because your defenses are stronger. You deflect with logic, not aggression. You win debates, not because you're right, but because you're better trained. The battlefield is tilted, not toward truth, but toward the best-equipped arguer. This happens silently. The trap doesn't announce itself. No alarm sounds when you use your intelligence to protect ego over truth. No warning light flashes when your reasoning becomes self-referential. The trap is invisible because it feels like clarity. You're not confused. You're confident. You're not doubting. You're explaining. You're not stuck. You're certain. But logic, without external friction, is just a spiral. And when intelligence is used to reduce friction, by filtering out opposing views, avoiding uncomfortable evidence, or rationalizing past choices, it's no longer a guide. It's an enabler, a self-affirming mechanism that makes every belief feel earned, every opinion feel justified, and every worldview feel inevitable. This is how smart people get stuck in ideological echo chambers, how brilliant thinkers defend pseudoscience, how educated minds support destructive systems. They don't lose their intelligence, they misapply it. They use it not to interrogate truth, but to protect identity, not to dismantle error, but to build stronger walls around it. The trap works best when the person inside it believes they're immune. The more confident you are in your own objectivity, the less likely you are to question your reasoning. And if you pride yourself on critical thinking, you may instinctively reject any suggestion that your intelligence is working against you. But that's the final twist. The trap defends itself with your own ego. So what's the way out? Humility, not as a moral virtue, but as a cognitive safeguard. The admission that intelligence is an immunity, that the smarter you are, the more likely your brain is to fool itself in sophisticated ways, that your clarity may be camouflage, that your logic might be a prison. Second, expose your ideas to resistance. Don't just argue, invite disagreement. Seek out the strongest counterarguments. Don't explain your views until you've tried to destroy them. Don't trust coherence, test consequences. Don't rely on polish, look for cracks. And third, separate intelligence from identity. You are not your arguments. You are not your conclusions. The moment your beliefs become part of your self-image, your intelligence stops seeking truth and starts protecting ego. This logic trap doesn't need emotion to spring. It's quiet, clean, rational. That's what makes it dangerous. It doesn't make you loud, it makes you convincing. It doesn't make you angry, it makes you elegant. But underneath that elegance is a recursive loop of logic serving itself. You're not dumb. You're not deluded. You're just smart enough to trap yourself, and too smart to notice. Logic trap number 2. Overthinking makes you easier to manipulate. Overthinking is often mistaken for clarity. It feels like caution, depth, and precision. You assume you're being more thorough, more rational, more prepared. But that's the illusion. Overthinking doesn't bring you closer to truth. It fractures your certainty, introduces hesitation, and opens space, not for insight, but for influence. At first, it appears logical to analyze a problem from multiple angles. You look for flaws. You consider outcomes. You anticipate objections. But in that process, you start creating alternatives that don't exist. Possibilities turn into probabilities. Doubts turn into dangers. You construct contingencies so detailed they override the original situation. And once your mind is spinning in contingencies, anyone who sounds confident can step in and offer a path out. That's the trap. Overthinking creates friction, and that friction becomes intolerable. It becomes a loop, an unresolved circuit that keeps restarting. The mind craves resolution, and when it can't produce one internally, it becomes vulnerable to external shortcuts. Someone tells you what to believe, what to do, what's safe, and because you're tired of thinking, it feels like relief. You don't stop because you've reached clarity. You stop because someone handed you closure. This is how intelligent people get manipulated, not through ignorance, but through mental fatigue, not through irrationality, but through rational overload. The more you think, the more abstract the problem becomes. the more abstract it becomes, the more disconnected your solutions feel. Eventually, emotion creeps in, not loud, but subtle. You want certainty, not truth, not accuracy, just something to hold on to. Overthinking is not a neutral act. It consumes focus. It dissolves urgency. It weakens confidence. And in the moment where you should act, you hesitate because there's always one more thing to consider. That pause is all a manipulator needs, because now they're not pushing you. They're guiding you out of your own paralysis. They don't even need to lie. They just need to be more decisive than you. The mind rewards closure. And when you're deep in overanalysis, anyone who offers a conclusion appears wise, even if it's false. That's how conspiracy theories work. That's how cult leaders operate. That's how abusive partners reframe reality. They don't argue better. They just offer relief. You overthink to avoid mistakes. But that very process makes you more susceptible to the confident, the bold, the emotionally manipulative. You've trained your brain to delay action. So when someone provides certainty, you interpret it as clarity. You interpret confidence as competence. And you surrender, not because you're weak, but because you're exhausted. There's another layer. The more intelligent you are, the more variables you can entertain. You generate complex scenarios, hypotheticals, alternative explanations. You build entire simulations in your mind. That ability makes you feel informed, but it also buries you under mental noise. It becomes harder to separate relevance from distraction. You lose track of which thoughts came from facts and which came from fear. And now, you're reacting to your own uncertainty. In this state, your mind no longer protects you. It destabilizes you. You begin to seek outside authority, not out of laziness, but because you've overloaded your internal system. And once external authority is established, even informally, you're more likely to trust it again. The trap isn't a single moment of manipulation. It's the installation of a mental shortcut, one that says, you don't need to figure it out. Just listen to them. This is where manipulation becomes systemic. You lose confidence in your independent judgment, and you begin to feel that certainty is something that must be given to you, not earned by you. The longer the overthinking continues, the more helpless you feel. The more helpless you feel, the more persuasive false confidence becomes, and the trap tightens. It's easy to assume that overthinking is a personality flaw, that it's just worry or indecision. But in reality, it's often a misuse of intelligence, a logical mind that doesn't know where to stop. It builds systems on top of systems, layers of evaluation, contingencies, assumptions, and then forgets which ones were real. You argue with yourself so effectively that you forget how to act. Manipulators don't win by outsmarting you. They win by recognizing that you've outsmarted yourself. They step into the void you've created. They frame your confusion as a problem only they can solve. And if their answer feels simpler than your internal mess, you take it. Not because it's right, but because it ends the loop. This pattern shows up in relationships, politics, philosophy, and even self-help. People gravitate towards certainty when their thinking has fractured their internal compass. The more abstract the questions, the more comforting a simple lie becomes. Overthinking also gives you the illusion of depth. You feel responsible, cautious, aware. But in truth, you're often just deeper inside a feedback loop. One layer of analysis generates another. One doubt produces 5 more. And instead of progressing toward a solution, you spiral into self-reference. Eventually, you mistake thought for progress. That's when you stop questioning the process. You assume the problem must be with the situation, not the method. But it's not always the situation that's unclear. Sometimes, it's your thinking that's directionless. Logic, when misapplied, doesn't clarify. It distorts. It breaks problems into smaller and smaller pieces until you can no longer remember what the original question was. And at that point, you're not deciding. You're escaping. escaping into certainty offered by someone else, escaping into avoidance, escaping into paralysis disguised as deliberation. There's a cost to this. Over time, you lose trust in your own decision-making. You hesitate by default. You begin to outsource your clarity. And the more you do that, the easier it becomes for others to shape your worldview. The trap isn't that you're not thinking. It's that you can't stop. So how do you escape? Not by abandoning thought, but by limiting it. Set boundaries on your mental processing. Decide what information is relevant. Determine when you have enough. And then act. Not because the action is perfect, but because endless precision is just another form of delay. Second, pay attention to how you respond to confidence in others. If it feels like relief, question it. Ask, is this person offering insight or just emotional closure? Are they solving the problem or just stopping the thinking? Third, remember, more thought is not always better thought. Intelligence is not defined by volume. It's defined by clarity, precision, and restraint. If your mind is building castles of logic without foundations, it's not helping you, it's trapping you. Overthinking doesn't mean you're weak. It means your brain is running without brakes. And the moment you look for someone else to stop the ride, you've handed them the controls. That's when influence becomes manipulation, and logic becomes your enemy. Logic trap number 3. Certainty feels safer than truth. Truth is not designed to comfort you. It doesn't care if you're ready for it, if it fits your worldview, or if it makes your life easier. Truth is often incomplete, inconvenient, and unstable. Certainty, on the other hand, is immediate. It feels secure. It quiets discomfort. And when the two collide, people tend to choose certainty, not because it's correct, but because it's safer to feel. This is the trap. The human mind treats emotional safety as evidence of accuracy. The less disturbed you feel, the more likely you are to believe something is true. That belief reinforces itself. Over time, your standard for truth becomes emotional consistency, not logical validity. You stop looking for what's real and start looking for what keeps your mind still. Certainty feels like clarity. It simplifies chaos. It silences ambiguity. It tells you where you stand, what's right, what's wrong, and who to trust. In a world full of doubt, that's seductive. But it comes at a cost. The more certain you feel, the less likely you are to question the foundation of that certainty. And once you stop questioning, truth becomes irrelevant. You're not immune because you're intelligent. In fact, intelligence often amplifies the trap. Smart people are better at constructing certainty. They find supporting evidence faster. They structure arguments more clearly. They defend their beliefs more convincingly. And as a result, their false certainty looks more like real truth, not just to others, but to themselves. Certainty creates psychological inertia. Once it settles in, it resists movement. New information isn't examined neutrally. It's filtered through the existing framework. If it aligns, it's accepted. If it threatens, it's dismissed, reinterpreted, or ignored. This filtering happens preconsciously. You don't feel it as distortion. You feel it as self-protection. The most dangerous certainty isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself with arrogance. It operates quietly, beneath the surface, embedded in habits, language, and mental shortcuts. It's the assumptions you don't question, the categories you never revise, the patterns you see everywhere because they've always been there. You don't notice the trap because it doesn't demand anything. It doesn't hurt. It doesn't provoke resistance. It just feels smooth, predictable, familiar. And in that familiarity, the need for truth fades. You don't need to ask if something is real. You just need to feel that it fits. This is where truth dies, not in conflict, but in comfort. Here's how it shows up. You hold a belief about politics, morality, religion, even yourself. That belief provides stability. It helps you make sense of the world. When you encounter information that conflicts with it, your mind tightens. You feel tension, doubt, or discomfort. But instead of investigating that discomfort, you escape it. You call the source biased. You label the information dangerous. You question the motive behind it, anything but the content itself. Why? Because truth threatens certainty, and certainty feels like survival. This isn't emotional weakness. It's a structural feature of cognition. The brain prefers resolution. Ambiguity is metabolically expensive. It creates open loops. Uncertainty requires constant processing. Certainty shuts the loop down. And when the loop closes, the system feels stable again. That sensation of mental quiet is interpreted as truth. That's the mistake. Truth is not supposed to feel good. It's supposed to reflect reality. And reality is often messy, conflicting, and incomplete. When you prioritize emotional stability over epistemic accuracy, you're not thinking, you're managing discomfort. This is how misinformation spreads. Not because it's persuasive, but because it's easy. It fits into pre-existing beliefs. It feels good to agree with. It doesn't require revision. People don't adopt it because they've weighed the evidence. They adopt it because it restores coherence. It offers immediate closure in the face of ambiguity. And once closure is achieved, the mind protects it like a wound that has just scabbed over. Anything that threatens to reopen it is treated as a threat, not to truth, to comfort. Certainty also feeds identity. The more certain you are of a belief, the more likely you are to fuse it with your sense of self. When that happens, disagreement feels personal. An attack on your views becomes an attack on you. And because self-preservation is stronger than truth-seeking, you stop evaluating arguments. You defend your identity. This is the deeper trap. Certainty doesn't just protect beliefs. It protects self-concept. And that makes it almost impossible to question without triggering a defensive response. You start surrounding yourself with people who reinforce your views. You avoid sources that challenge your framework. You interpret opposing arguments as ignorant, biased, or evil, not because they are, but because they force you to feel uncertain again. And uncertainty, at this point, is indistinguishable from danger. That's how systems of belief become sealed, not through censorship, but through emotional insulation, not through lies, but through the selective amplification of truths that feel good. The illusion isn't just in what you believe, it's in how protected those beliefs make you feel. Intelligence can't solve this. In fact, intelligence often reinforces it. The smarter you are, the better you are at defending a false certainty. The more eloquent your explanations become, the more symmetrical your worldview appears. And the harder it becomes for you or anyone else to point out that the structure itself is wrong. You can argue someone into certainty, but you cannot argue them out of it. Because certainty is not a conclusion, it's a state, a feeling. And once it sets in, truth becomes negotiable. So how do you escape? First, recognize that certainty is a signal, not of truth, but of psychological relief. When something feels absolutely right, examine why. Is it the evidence or the emotion it calms? Second, invite dissonance. Seek out views that threaten your assumptions, not to destroy them, but to test their strength. If a belief can't survive challenge, it isn't stable, it's fragile. And if you refuse to test it, you're not preserving truth, you're preserving comfort. Third, learn to sit in uncertainty. Let discomfort exist without rushing to close it. Truth is often slow, complex, partial. If your mind craves instant resolution, you're not thinking, you're soothing. Certainty is not wisdom, it's anesthesia. And when it feels safest, that's when it's most dangerous. Logic trap number 4. Confidence can be manufactured. Confidence is usually interpreted as a signal of truth. We trust people who sound certain. We defer to those who speak without hesitation. In conversation, negotiation, teaching, politics, and everyday life. Confidence functions as a shortcut, a way to judge credibility without examining every fact. But here's the trap: confidence isn't evidence. It's a performance, and it can be manufactured. The appearance of certainty is not the same as understanding. A person can speak fluently, assertively, and logically, and still be completely wrong. But we're not trained to dissect accuracy. We're trained to detect confidence. Because in the absence of full information, confidence feels like clarity. This makes it one of the most manipulable tools in logic-based persuasion. You don't have to be right. You just have to sound like you are. You don't have to prove your knowledge. You just have to suppress visible doubt. And when you do that consistently, people assume truth not because of what you say, but because of how you say it. This is how false beliefs spread through intelligence circles. They don't come dressed in hysteria or emotional appeals. They come wearing the uniform of rationality, calm tone, structured reasoning, minimal hedging. The more formal and confident the delivery, the more difficult it becomes to challenge the underlying logic, because our minds confuse confidence with proof. This doesn't just apply to others. It applies to your own internal voice. The more often you repeat an idea with confidence, even internally, the more real it feels. Your brain builds mental fluency around it, and that fluency gets mistaken for accuracy. You don't re-examine the claim. You re-experience the feeling of knowing. And each time you do, the belief solidifies, not because it's true, but because it's well-rehearsed. That's how manufactured confidence works. It starts with a shallow idea, wraps it in conviction, and repeats it until resistance fades. No new evidence is required. No deeper understanding is needed. Just the removal of uncertainty from tone, structure, and presentation. Now the belief feels real because the delivery feels smooth. This dynamic is amplified in intelligent people because the more articulate you are, the easier it is to fake certainty. You know how to construct an argument. You know how to preempt objections. You can simulate clarity without possessing it. And because you've been rewarded for sounding right in the past, you start to rely on performance over substance. This is the core of the trap. The skill of sounding right detaches from the discipline of being right. Once confidence becomes a reflex, truth becomes optional. This shows up everywhere. In meetings, the person who speaks first, clearly, confidently, is often believed, even if they're speculating. In group settings, the most certain opinion becomes the default, even when it hasn't been tested. In relationships, the more decisive partner often defines the narrative, not because they're right, but because they're unshaken. Confidence wins not because it's valid, but because it's louder than ambiguity. And the longer it goes unchallenged, the more people treat it as reality. This is especially dangerous in domains where truth is complex, evolving, or hard to prove. Science, politics, ethics, medicine, economics, none of these lend themselves to immediate certainty. But when someone speaks with polished conviction, it silences nuance. It creates the illusion that there's one answer. That doubt is weakness. That complexity is incompetence. So people defer, not to truth, but to the clearest voice in the room. And that voice may not be informed. It may just be unshaken. This creates a feedback loop. The more confidence is rewarded, the more it's imitated. People learn that performance matters more than precision, so they reduce their hedging. They eliminate pauses. They stop admitting uncertainty. And as a result, discourse becomes a contest of appearances, not ideas. The smartest voices begin disappearing under the loudest ones. Even in your own thinking, this trap operates silently. When you express an opinion with confidence, your mind starts treating it as a reference point. You return to it, you reinforce it, and slowly, it becomes part of your internal certainty, even if it was never validated. Confidence becomes self-generated, and once you believe it yourself, it becomes indistinguishable from truth. This is not a question of arrogance. It's a structural flaw in how reasoning is expressed. When logical presentation is confused with logical foundation, confidence can be faked, and once faked, it behaves like truth, and the trap tightens. You start avoiding uncertainty, not just in tone, but in thought. You stop entertaining possibilities that require hedging. You focus on what you can say clearly, not what's actually real. Your internal logic begins to mirror your external performance. And when performance becomes the standard, truth becomes unstable. So what's the consequence? You stop noticing the gap between what you know and how you sound. You believe your own fluency. You stop asking, "Is this accurate?" and start asking, "Does this make sense?" Those aren't the same. One tests content, the other tests structure. But logic without truth is just well-formed error. And the more convincing the error sounds, the harder it is to detect, especially to the one speaking it. This isn't about deception. It's about psychological efficiency. The brain prefers fluency over friction. And once an idea flows smoothly, it becomes part of the mental infrastructure. You don't doubt it. You build on it. That's how smart people end up defending systems they barely understand. How intelligent voices reinforce myths they never tested. How confidence becomes a substitute for knowledge. You're not lying. You're echoing yourself. And every time you do, you dig the trap deeper. So what's the way out? Recognize that confidence is not a conclusion. It's a state. One that can be manufactured, rehearsed, and mistaken for truth. When someone speaks with certainty, ask, "Is this confidence justified or just performed?" Second, retrain your response to confidence in others. Don't reward clarity alone. Reward humility. Reward complexity. Reward the ability to say, "I don't know," or "that depends." Third, examine your own confidence. Where does it come from? Evidence? Experience? Or repetition? Are you sure because the logic is sound, or because the tone feels right? Confidence is useful, but when it's divorced from accuracy, it becomes a liability, a mirror that reflects belief, not reality. The more easily it can be manufactured, the more dangerous it becomes. And when intelligence is used to build it, that danger hides behind. Logic trap number 5, the illusion of being objective. Objectivity is the most praised ideal in logic-based thinking. To be objective is to be fair, neutral, unclouded by emotion or bias. It's the posture of clarity, the stance of reason. But here's the problem. Believing you are objective does not make you objective. And assuming you are immune to bias is what makes bias most effective. This is the trap. The more certain you are of your own objectivity, the more likely you are to be operating inside unexamined assumptions. And the more invested you become in appearing neutral, the less capable you are of admitting when you're not. Objectivity, in theory, is a process, a discipline of checking your beliefs against evidence, adjusting for known biases, and acknowledging uncertainty. But in practice, it often becomes an identity. People begin to think of themselves as rational thinkers, data-driven, or free from emotion. And once that identity forms, it needs to be defended, not truth, not process, the identity itself. This creates a double-layered illusion. First, you believe your conclusions are valid because they came from someone who is objective. Second, you believe that someone is you. The mind stops testing the idea and starts protecting the self-image. Now, when someone disagrees, you don't see it as a difference in interpretation. You see it as a failure on their part. They must be biased. They must be emotional. Because you, by default, are neutral. You're not aware that neutrality has been replaced with superiority. You believe you're the baseline. Everyone else is the deviation. But objectivity is not a default. It's a tension, a resistance, a constant process of checking, revising, and doubting. And once that process stops, what remains is not objectivity. It's confidence wrapped in neutrality's clothing. The more skilled you are in argument, the easier it becomes to simulate this posture. You can reference studies, quote theories, lay out logic, all while being deeply embedded in a worldview you never examined. The performance is convincing, but it's still a performance. This is especially dangerous when intelligence is involved. Smart people learn quickly how to sound neutral, how to remove hedging from their tone, how to make emotional claims appear analytical. They know which words imply fairness without proving it. And because they're often rewarded for balanced thinking, they confuse the absence of visible emotion with the presence of accuracy. But neutrality in tone doesn't equal neutrality in thought. You can speak calmly and still be driven by unconscious bias. You can sound logical and still be selectively blind to inconvenient facts. You can wear the mask of objectivity and still be defending a fragile narrative. And the more you believe your tone proves your fairness, the less likely you are to notice what your reasoning leaves out. This is how people end up reinforcing systemic bias while claiming neutrality. How false equivalencies are presented as balance. How complex moral issues get flattened into statistical comparisons. The tone is clean. The language is precise. The conclusions sound reasonable. But the process is hollow, because objectivity was never the method. It was the aesthetic. Here's the core flaw. We don't perceive our own lenses. We see through them. We interpret facts through frames we didn't choose. Cultural context, personal experience, language, cognitive shortcuts. These things shape what we notice, what we ignore, and how we interpret uncertainty. But instead of acknowledging this, we often declare ourselves impartial, especially when challenged. We double down on the belief that we just follow the facts, just look at data, or just apply logic. That's the final twist of the trap. We confuse the tools of reasoning with immunity from error. You can use logic and still be wrong. You can follow data and still draw faulty conclusions. You can cite science and still ignore variables. Objectivity isn't guaranteed by method. It's earned through discipline. And that discipline requires admitting that you're never fully neutral, that your thoughts are always shaped by invisible scaffolding, that your interpretations are never pure. They're just structured. Most people don't want to admit this, because the illusion of objectivity feels powerful. It feels above the fray, above emotion, above bias. But in truth, it's the most fragile position of all. Because the moment your logic becomes part of your identity, you stop adjusting it. You defend it, not with emotion, but with reason. And that's what makes it so hard to detect. You're not yelling. You're not ranting. You're not visibly emotional. You're just calmly, confidently, and logically reinforcing a belief you never questioned. And you believe that your calm tone proves you're right. But that calm isn't clarity. It's insulation. So what's the cost? You become harder to reach. You dismiss critique as noise. You mistake disagreement for ignorance. You filter data to match your model. And because your delivery sounds rational, others stop challenging you too. The illusion grows stronger. Your beliefs go untested. Your confidence increases. And your capacity to update dissolves. This is how rational people become ideologues. How neutrality turns into dogma. How intelligent thinkers drift into extremism, not through anger, but through silent conviction. So how do you escape? Start by dismantling the identity. Stop thinking of yourself as objective. Think of yourself as a system, one that can be miscalibrated, one that requires input from opposing views, one that must remain open to correction. Second, invite dissonance. If every piece of data you encounter confirms your belief, you're not being objective, you're being selective. Seek out contradiction, not to win, but to test. Third, distinguish tone from method. A calm voice is not a logical process. A measured explanation is not the same as critical thinking. Don't let performance confuse you, especially when the performer is you. Objectivity is not a trait. It's a practice. And the moment you assume you've mastered it, you've already lost it. Logic trap number 6. You can be precise and still be wrong. Precision is often mistaken for correctness. When an idea is stated clearly, measured exactly, and supported by structured logic, it feels true, even if it isn't. The sharper the language, the more trustworthy it appears. The cleaner the argument, the more credible it sounds. But here's the trap. Precision does not guarantee accuracy. It only gives the illusion of it. A wrong idea, framed with precise logic, becomes harder to question. Not because it's stronger, but because it's harder to see the flaw through the polish. Precision creates confidence, and confidence hides error. This is the danger of clean logic. It feels stable. It gives form to uncertainty. It lets you anchor your conclusions in something tangible. But if the foundation is flawed, if the assumption is false, the data incomplete, or the context ignored, then the more precisely you build, the more exact your mistake becomes. You're not guessing. You're not lying. You're simply being wrong in a highly structured way. Intelligence amplifies this. Smart people build airtight arguments on top of thin premises. They excel at isolating variables, defining terms, controlling for exceptions. And in doing so, they create perfect models of the wrong world. The logic holds. The reasoning flows. But the outcome is false because the inputs were wrong. This doesn't feel like error. It feels like mastery, because you're fluent in the system you've created. Every part fits. Every step follows. There's no contradiction until you step outside the frame. But inside the frame, you can't see what's missing. You can only see what's consistent. That's the core of the trap. Consistency masquerades as truth. Precision replaces doubt. And logic becomes a machine that reproduces error with perfect efficiency. This happens in science, philosophy, mathematics, and daily reasoning. Someone defines a problem, sets boundaries, applies logic, and arrives at a conclusion that feels indisputable. But the flaw wasn't in the process. It was in the question, the context, or the initial framing. You get the right answer to the wrong problem. And because the answer is precise, you don't notice that it's irrelevant. This is how ideologies persist. They're internally coherent. They explain the world in self-reinforcing ways. Every contradiction is pre-handled. Every objection has a clause. The logic isn't broken. It's just disconnected from external truth. But the clearer it sounds, the harder it is to challenge, because it feels like you're opposing reason itself. And once that clarity settles, you stop examining the parts. You trust the whole. You no longer ask, is this true? You ask, does this follow? Those aren't the same question. This kind of precision is especially persuasive in public discourse. People don't have time to verify every detail. They rely on presentation. So when something is presented cleanly, step by step, conclusion by conclusion, they assume it's been vetted, that the logic protects it. But logic is not a firewall. It's a processor. It works with what it's given. If you feed it flawed premises, it will generate flawed conclusions with stunning precision. That's what makes it dangerous. You don't notice the error because there's no friction. The process is smooth. The result is elegant. The packaging is clean. It doesn't feel like a mistake. It feels like clarity. But clarity isn't proof. This becomes self-reinforcing. The more precise you're thinking, the more confident you feel. The more confident you feel, the less you test your assumptions. You mistake refinement for depth. You believe the structure confirms the truth. But structure isn't substance. It's just shape. And shape can be perfect, while the contents are hollow. Here's how it plays out in real thinking. You start with a flawed or incomplete assumption. You build a model around it. You define every term. You simulate outcomes. You remove ambiguity. And the result is seamless. So seamless, in fact, that you never think to go back and question the premise. You don't notice that the foundation wasn't verified because the structure looks correct. And once the structure becomes convincing, the premise becomes sacred. To question it would require dismantling the entire model. And no one wants to undo precision they've worked to build. So the model becomes the truth. Not because it is, but because it's the only system that still holds together under scrutiny. And if it holds together, it must be real. That's the illusion. This happens on personal, institutional, and societal levels. People build belief systems around selective data, philosophies around isolated examples, policies around clean abstractions. And because the outputs look logical, the models are trusted. But if the logic serves a flawed frame, the results are noise. You can prove anything with the right definitions. You can justify anything with tight reasoning. You can defend anything with internal logic. And once you can, you stop asking if you should. Precision replaces evaluation. Clean outcomes replace deep questions. Logic becomes a tool not of discovery, but of reinforcement. And every time it works, your confidence increases. So how do you escape? Start by questioning the base. Ask what assumptions your reasoning depends on. Not whether the logic works, but whether the inputs are real, full, and tested. Second, notice the feeling of fluency. When your argument flows too smoothly, pause. Ask if you've created a structure that's too clean to challenge. If so, you may be replicating error, not resolving it. Third, separate elegance from truth. Precision is not the enemy, but it becomes one when it's used to hide doubt. Allow for roughness, uncertainty, disruption, not as flaws, but as signs that truth is being tested. A flawless model is not a true one. It's just a mistake in perfect shape. The sharper the edge, the deeper the cut. And if your logic is too precise, it may be slicing away the truth. Logic trap number 7. Intelligence creates patterns that aren't there. Intelligence excels at detecting structure. It finds order in chaos, connections in randomness, and meaning in noise. This ability is not just useful, it's foundational. It helps humans navigate uncertainty, extract rules, predict behavior, and make decisions in an unstable world. But it also creates a trap, because when the mind becomes too efficient at pattern recognition, it starts seeing patterns where none exist. And the smarter the mind, the more convincing the illusion. This is the trap. Intelligence doesn't just interpret reality, it constructs it. And once a pattern is perceived, the mind begins filtering all new information through that lens. What started as observation becomes a framework. What began as a guess becomes a rule. You're not just seeing order, you're manufacturing it. The problem isn't the detection of patterns. It's the uncritical acceptance of them. When your mind sees something twice, it assumes it's a trend. 3 times, and it feels like a law. You stop looking at the data objectively. You begin expecting the pattern. And when you expect something, you start finding it, whether it's there or not. This becomes especially dangerous when the pattern is emotionally satisfying. If a certain structure makes sense of something painful, complicated, or ambiguous, the mind doesn't just accept it, it clings to it. It doesn't matter if the pattern is shallow, coincidental, or false. What matters is that it makes you feel like you understand. That feeling of understanding becomes addictive, and you stop checking the pattern's validity. You just confirm it. You notice more examples that fit. You ignore ones that don't. Your perception narrows. You construct narratives that reinforce the structure. And slowly, the line between real causality and imagined correlation dissolves. This is how conspiracy theories grow. It's how cognitive biases form. It's how personal superstitions persist. The pattern feels internally coherent, and that internal coherence gets mistaken for external truth. The more intelligent you are, the more complex the pattern can become. You don't just notice a coincidence. You build a system. You connect historical dots. You align concepts. You simulate scenarios. And because each part feeds into the next with logical consistency, it all feels true. But logic can support fiction just as easily as it supports fact. And when logic reinforces a false pattern, intelligence becomes a liability, not a safeguard. This trap is difficult to detect because it feels like insight. The moment the pattern clicks, the brain rewards you. Dopamine is released. Confidence increases. You feel sharp, perceptive, ahead of the curve. You believe you've spotted something others missed. And that belief becomes self-reinforcing. Every additional match you observe makes you feel smarter. You feel validated. But what you're actually doing is increasing your emotional investment in an unverified structure. And emotional investment blocks correction. Now you're no longer observing. You're interpreting. You're no longer testing. You're affirming. This is how ideologies solidify, how confirmation bias intensifies, how misinterpretations spread, and how people mistake their mental models for reality. Here's the deeper layer. The smarter you are, the better you become at explaining the pattern. You find analogies. You cite history. You anticipate objections. You defend the coherence with structured logic. And no one challenges you because your logic is sound. But sound logic on a false pattern is just elegant error. Your intelligence has created a map. And now you're mistaking the map for the terrain. Once that happens, you start using the pattern to make decisions. You use it to explain the behavior of others. You use it to justify your choices. You use it to predict the future. And because reality is full of noise, you will always find some events that appear to confirm the model. That confirmation fuels the illusion. You now have evidence. You now have data. But the evidence is selectively perceived, and the data is interpreted through a pre-existing structure. There's no independent verification, only circular reasoning. You're not lying to yourself. You're building a worldview, and you're using your intelligence to make it airtight. This is how smart people become trapped. They're not wrong because they lack information. They're wrong because they overstructure information. They turn noise into narrative. They mistake coincidence for law. And they defend the result because it feels earned. But effort does not equal truth, and complexity does not equal correctness. This trap shows up in small personal habits and large ideological movements. A person has a few bad experiences with a specific group, and they begin to notice negative traits more often. An investor sees a few successful trends and starts believing in a predictive pattern. A philosopher sees links between historical events and builds an entire framework on causation that isn't causal. And because they're intelligent, they can argue the pattern in detail. They can cite cases. They can simulate alternatives. They can defend the idea against criticism. But they never go back to question the original pattern, because that would require them to dismantle the entire structure. And when structure becomes identity, correction becomes impossible. This is the final twist. The smarter the person, the more tied their intelligence becomes to their mental model. Their sense of value, stability, and purpose becomes wrapped around the framework they've built. And challenging the pattern is no longer just a logical correction, it's a personal threat. So how do you escape? You start by assuming your patterns are provisional, not permanent. Every mental structure you build should come with an expiration date. Don't just ask, does this make sense? Ask, what would it take to disprove this? Second, expose your patterns to noise. Seek out anomalies. Don't just confirm, challenge. If a pattern can't survive contradiction, it isn't stable. It's fragile. Third, remember that the feeling of understanding is not proof of truth. Insight feels good. That doesn't make it right. Just because a pattern explains something doesn't mean it reflects reality. Intelligence is a tool. But when it starts building what it wants to see, it's no longer a guide. It's a trap that looks like clarity. And the more complex the pattern becomes, the harder it is to admit it was never really there. Logic trap number 8. Explanations replace understanding. Explanations are designed to simplify the complex, clarify the obscure, and reduce uncertainty. They serve as bridges between information and comprehension. But there's a hidden failure point, because when the explanation is satisfying, the mind often assumes the problem is understood, even if it isn't. And the more articulate the explanation, the easier it becomes to mistake familiarity for knowledge. This is the trap. The explanation stands in for the thing itself. You stop investigating the underlying mechanism. You stop asking fundamental questions. You accept the description as sufficient. The brain substitutes linguistic closure for actual understanding. This substitution happens quietly. You hear a well-framed answer. It has structure. It uses correct terms. It flows logically. It sounds complete. You feel the internal click of comprehension. But what you're responding to is fluency, not depth. You now know something because it was explainable, not because it was verified, internalized, or understood. This process is amplified by intelligence. A smart person can generate clean explanations faster. They can fill in gaps with analogies. They can reframe confusion into coherence. And the smoother the explanation, the less friction the brain feels. That absence of friction gets misread as mastery. But mastering language is not the same as mastering knowledge. You can describe the engine and still not understand combustion. You can repeat psychological terms and still not grasp the mechanisms of behavior. You can summarize a theory without knowing its foundation. The problem is that the brain rewards the surface equally. It doesn't distinguish between understanding and the appearance of understanding. If the explanation flows, if the concepts feel familiar, you feel confident, and confidence reinforces the illusion. This becomes particularly dangerous when explanations are built on weak foundations. If the original data is flawed, the explanation doesn't correct it, it conceals it. And because the language is smooth, the error becomes harder to detect. The explanation becomes a mask for ignorance. This trap is common in science communication, self-help, political analysis, and education. People learn explanations, memorize frameworks, and recite models, but they never touch the original material. They never reconstruct the reasoning. They operate entirely on summaries, and summaries cannot be interrogated. They can only be repeated. This makes it easy for false ideas to persist. If the explanation is emotionally satisfying or intellectually elegant, it outlives the evidence. People continue to teach it, defend it, and build on it because the explanation still works at the linguistic level. They're fluent in the form, but the content is hollow. This is how bad science lingers in public understanding, how flawed economic models continue to guide policy, how simplistic psychological theories dominate discourse. It's not because people are malicious. It's because the explanation arrived before the understanding did. And once it's installed, it resists revision. Here's the deeper layer. Explanations become identity markers. The ability to explain something fluently makes you appear competent. In academic, professional, and social settings, this fluency becomes a proxy for value. People who explain well are seen as smart, so they keep explaining more cleanly, more often, more confidently. And as they do, they move further from actual inquiry. The smarter they become at articulation, the less time they spend on examination. The explanation becomes its own justification. That's the core of the trap: fluency without foundation, coherence without causality, logic without learning. It doesn't feel wrong. It feels impressive. You're not pretending. You're performing. And the audience is convinced, including you. This dynamic becomes self-reinforcing. The more fluent you are, the more you're trusted. The more you're trusted, the less you're challenged. The less you're challenged, the fewer disruptions you experience. And with no disruption, the illusion of understanding deepens. You start to believe your own explanations. You stop checking them. You use them as shortcuts in future reasoning. They become the scaffolding for more explanations. But each new layer is built on an untested floor. Eventually, you reach a point where your entire knowledge structure is made of abstractions. You know the terminology. You know the analogies. You know how to talk about the thing. But you don't know the thing itself. This is common in modern intellectual environments. People cite studies they haven't read, reference books they've skimmed, quote experts without understanding the methodology. And because everyone is speaking the same fluent language, no one notices that the foundation is missing. It all sounds correct, but it's just structured repetition. This trap is worsened by information density. In a world saturated with articles, videos, and summaries, the pressure to keep up encourages shallow absorption. People consume content not to learn, but to explain, to participate, to sound informed. The metric becomes expression, not comprehension, and when the reward system favors appearance over depth, explanation replaces understanding entirely. The mind adjusts to the new goal, not to know, but to explain smoothly. This isn't laziness. It's optimization. The brain, like any system, defaults to efficiency. If it gets the same reward for surface as it does for substance, it chooses surface. It's faster, easier, more socially advantageous. And once it's trained to prefer explanation, deeper inquiry becomes less tolerable. Questions feel slow. Doubt feels inconvenient. Complexity feels like failure. So the loop accelerates. Learn just enough to explain. Then move on. Repeat. Build layers of language. But never descend into the structure. And the more skilled you are at this, the more convincing your performance becomes. So how do you escape? Start by asking what your explanation is hiding. What part of the system are you describing without understanding? What assumptions are you repeating because they sounded right? Second, slow down your thinking. Force yourself to reconstruct the logic, not the phrasing, the reasoning. If you can't rebuild the concept from basic principles, you don't know it. You're echoing. Third, remove fluency as a metric. Don't reward yourself for being clear. Reward yourself for being correct. And correctness requires discomfort. It means admitting ignorance, sitting in ambiguity, letting things be unresolved. Understanding is slow. Explanation is fast. But only one survives contact with reality. And if all you've mastered is the surface, your knowledge will collapse the moment something refuses to be explained. Logic trap number 9. The wrong question feels right. Every line of reasoning begins with a question. It sets the frame. It defines the limits of thought. It decides what matters and what doesn't. But when the initial question is flawed, everything that follows, even if perfectly reasoned, leads nowhere. That's the trap. Intelligence makes the wrong question feel like the right one. And once you've committed to solving it, you don't stop to ask whether it should be solved at all. This failure isn't in the logic, it's in the premise. The question appears meaningful. It's structured well. It produces interesting answers. It inspires debate. But the foundation is off. It may contain a false assumption, a misleading binary, or an emotional bait. Still, you pursue it, because the structure of the question feels like clarity. This happens across domains: philosophy, politics, ethics, economics, personal development. A question is posed. Should we prioritize freedom or safety? Is this person good or evil? What's the secret to success? And people begin answering, debating, arguing. They build models, create content, deliver speeches. But no one stops to dismantle the question. The question itself becomes sacred. And that's where the damage begins. Because once a question becomes the foundation for a belief system, every answer built on it inherits the flaw. The entire structure is logically consistent and completely wrong. This is especially dangerous for intelligent thinkers. The smarter you are, the more likely you are to take the question and run with it. You break it down. You model it. You test its parts. You debate its variables. You apply it to real life. And the more you engage, the less likely you are to go back and examine the original premise. That's the core of the trap. The problem-solving mind doesn't like to stop. Once a question is seen as valid, it becomes a project. And once it becomes a project, it becomes personal. You don't want to abandon it. You want to solve it. And solving the wrong question feels like progress. You feel like you're getting somewhere. You build an internal framework. You write, teach, explain. You gather followers. And slowly, the performance of clarity replaces the pursuit of truth. But clarity is not the same as orientation. You may have a perfect compass, but if the map is wrong, every step leads you further away from reality. Here's the deeper issue. False questions often disguise themselves in emotional urgency. They target your values, your fears, your identity. They sound important. They activate stakes. What side are you on? What kind of person does this make you? Why aren't you outraged? And once you engage, the emotional hook ensures that you won't re-examine the question. Because the moment you step back, you risk undermining your moral or intellectual posture. So you keep going. You pick a side. You refine your position. You escalate your clarity. And now the question has created a system of answers, a system of beliefs, a system of social alliances, all built on an illusion. This is how movements, ideologies, and paradigms drift. They don't collapse because they're wrong. They persist because the question still feels right. The structure keeps producing answers. The debate stays alive. And as long as answers are possible, people assume the question must be valid. But logic is indifferent to origin. It will produce conclusions from any input. If the question is flawed, the answers will be flawed. If the frame is narrow, the logic will be narrow. If the assumption is false, the reasoning will defend the falsehood. That's the problem with smart reasoning. It's too good at building. It builds on anything. The trap isn't just intellectual. It's behavioral. Once you begin acting on a false frame, the real consequences start. You make choices, spend money, allocate time, change habits, align with people, create policies, and those actions reinforce the question's perceived legitimacy. After all, why would you sacrifice for something untrue? So you double down. You defend your choices. You repeat the question. You stop listening to people who reject it because they feel off topic, irrational, or hostile. In reality, they're rejecting the trap. But you can't see that because the trap feels like a path. You're not lost. You're just solving the wrong problem very well. This shows up in personal thinking too. Someone asks, "Why can't I be happy?" The answers spiral. I need more money. I need a relationship. I need purpose. But no one asks, is happiness the right frame? Is the question even valid? Or someone asks, how do I win this argument? Instead of what am I missing? The question defines the goal. And the goal becomes ego preservation, not truth. In these moments, logic isn't failing. It's doing exactly what it was trained to do. It's building coherent structures from flawed premises. And the more intelligent the thinker, the more elegant the failure becomes. So how do you escape? Start by questioning the question. Ask where it came from, who benefits from you solving it, what assumptions it smuggles in, what it makes invisible, what it forces you to choose between. Second, notice emotional urgency. If a question feels high stakes, binary, or loaded with identity, pause. High-pressure questions are rarely neutral. They often serve to trap, not clarify. Third, check the problem's orientation. Is it moving you toward reality, or just deeper into abstraction? Are the answers solving anything tangible, or just producing more language? And finally, stop measuring insight by answer quality alone. Start measuring by question quality. Because the better the question, the less performance is needed. And the worse the question, the more reasoning becomes camouflage. You can be intelligent, you can be precise, you can be persuasive, and still be building your whole life on the wrong question. Logic trap number 10. Rationalizing isn't thinking. Rationalization feels like thought. It looks like logic. It mimics analysis. But it's not reasoning, it's defense. It begins after the decision is made, after the belief is formed, after the conclusion is reached. Then, and only then, the mind begins to construct its justification. It looks backward and calls it forward. It builds a rationale, not a reason. This is the trap. Rationalization imitates thinking so well that even intelligent people don't notice the difference. In fact, the smarter you are, the more convincing your rationalizations become to others and to yourself. Thinking is slow. It questions assumptions. It tolerates ambiguity. It exposes flaws. It tests conclusions. Rationalizing, by contrast, is fast. It protects assumptions. It smooths over contradiction. It silences doubt. It defends conclusions already made. But they feel identical. When you're rationalizing, your internal monologue doesn't sound like manipulation. It sounds like clarity. You're not covering up a weakness. You're explaining it. You're not justifying a poor decision. You're interpreting it. You're not avoiding truth. You're reframing it. This imitation is so precise that there's no internal alarm. You don't feel dishonest. You feel coherent. And coherence is what the brain rewards, not truth. Not accuracy, coherence. The pieces fit. The logic holds. The structure makes sense. So it must be right. But it isn't, because the destination was chosen first. The belief existed before the argument. And once a belief exists, logic can be weaponized to protect it. This is where intelligence becomes a liability. A highly intelligent person can generate complex rationalizations with speed and elegance. They can create arguments that anticipate objections. They can make irrational choices appear not just reasonable, but necessary. And they can do it so convincingly that no one, not even themselves, detects the flaw. The flaw is not in the logic. The flaw is in the sequence. The process didn't begin with observation. It began with desire, fear, ego, or convenience. And then it reached for reasoning, not to discover the truth, but to justify the feeling. This is common in personal decisions. People buy something impulsively and then construct reasons after. They end relationships or cling to them and then explain the behavior with invented narratives. They choose careers based on status or security and then create logical arguments to support what was originally an emotional choice. But this also happens in politics, science, and belief systems. A conclusion is socially, emotionally, or ideologically useful. It becomes comfortable. Then the arguments begin, not to test it, but to defend it. The structure looks logical, but it's a reverse-engineered defense. And no matter how intelligent the person is, the logic only protects the initial bias. The more confident you are in your ability to think clearly, the less likely you are to suspect this reversal. You assume you reasoned your way to your belief. You assume your logic is objective. But it's not logic. It's loyalty to the conclusion, to the identity, to the image of rationality. And this loyalty becomes stronger the more it's defended. Every time you explain your view, it becomes harder to revise. Not because the argument gets better, but because the investment increases. You've built something. You've said it publicly. You've won debates with it. And now, changing your mind would cost you status, clarity, and self-image. So you don't. You rationalize again. You double down. You update the surface, not the structure. And you call that growth. This is the second layer of the trap. You confuse better rationalization with better thinking. You assume that complexity equals evolution, that more nuanced explanations mean you're getting closer to the truth. But if you're still protecting the same flawed conclusion, The sophistication is just camouflage. Rationalization becomes more elegant, not more accurate. And every layer of elegance pushes real thought further away. The cost of this is subtle. You lose your ability to think backward, to unbuild, to dismantle, to retract. You lose flexibility, not in your ability to argue, but in your ability to revise. The mind becomes rigid, not because it's dumb, but because it's overtrained in self-defense. This rigidity doesn't feel like error. It feels like conviction. And conviction, once rooted in rationalization, becomes impermeable. This is how intelligent people become ideologues. Not by ignoring logic, but by bending it. Not by suppressing thought, but by directing it toward protection. They outthink criticism. They preempt dissonance. They surround their beliefs with intellectual armor. And no one notices, because the armor looks like brilliance. So how do you escape? Start by asking not what your argument is, but when it began. Did it follow the belief, or did it produce it? If you can't remember questioning the conclusion, you probably didn't. Second, notice the sequence of thought. Are you reasoning toward something, or backward from it? Are you testing your position, or maintaining it? Third, invite disruption. Find people who don't share your beliefs, not to debate them, but to examine how your beliefs respond to friction. If your argument becomes more emotional, defensive, or complicated in response, you're probably rationalizing. Fourth, watch for fluency. When your explanation feels too smooth, too automatic, it's probably not fresh thinking. It's rehearsed. You're not exploring, you're reciting. Real thinking is uncomfortable. It revises itself. It hesitates. It stumbles. It allows for interruption. Rationalization is smooth, proud, and sealed. One is a process. The other is a product. And only one of them leads anywhere real. Logic trap number 11. The more you explain, the less you notice. Explanation is often treated as a virtue. It's associated with clarity, intelligence, and understanding. When someone can explain something in detail, they're seen as informed. When someone can't, they're dismissed. But here's the flaw. The act of explaining draws attention inward. It focuses the mind on expression, not observation. And the more time you spend explaining, the less capacity you have to notice what you've missed. This is the trap. Explanation is a spotlight. It narrows your attention. It forces you to organize information into a coherent sequence. That sequence feels like insight. It becomes a path, one step leading to the next. But the spotlight only shows what fits inside the path. Anything outside of it, however important, is ignored. You stop noticing contradictions. You stop scanning for exceptions. You stop observing anomalies. Because once your mind is busy preparing explanations, it's no longer listening. It's building. And what it builds starts to shape what you believe is real. This mechanism is not malicious. It's efficient. The brain prefers fluency over friction. It rewards narratives that are easy to deliver and understand. So when you find a structure that works, you reuse it. You explain it again. And every repetition makes you less sensitive to new information. You become fluent, then automatic, then blind. This is especially common among intelligent people. The more articulate you are, the easier it becomes to wrap any idea in explanation. You can organize data quickly, translate it clearly, preempt objections. You become persuasive. But persuasion is not perception. And if you're explaining more than you're observing, your knowledge base starts to ossify. You stop updating, not because you refuse to learn, but because you're always expressing what you already know. That's the illusion. You feel active. You feel sharp. You're thinking, speaking, teaching. But the direction of mental energy is outward. It's output, not input. You're delivering, not scanning, not questioning. And when you're not scanning, you stop noticing change. This becomes dangerous in rapidly evolving environments. Science, technology, Markets, cultural shifts, these move faster than anyone's explanatory model. But once you have a working explanation, you resist rewriting it. Not because it's right, but because it's functional. Function is mistaken for truth. And when the explanation continues to work in limited contexts, your mind treats it as complete. You stop testing its boundaries. You stop asking where it fails. You keep refining the expression, not the idea. Eventually, your explanation outlives its accuracy. But you don't notice, because you're not looking for the failure point. You're looking for the best way to say the same thing again. This is how frameworks become dogmas, how thinkers become preachers, how open minds become closed systems. It doesn't happen through arrogance. It happens through repetition. The explanation becomes the belief. The belief becomes the filter. And the filter becomes invisible. You start selecting information that confirms your version of events. You avoid areas where your model doesn't apply. You stop seeking feedback that feels disruptive. And you convince yourself that you're adapting because you're constantly refining the wording. But refining is not revising. You're polishing a structure that no longer reflects the world. Here's the deeper problem. Every explanation is a compression. It takes a complex reality and reduces it into something communicable. That reduction removes noise, detail, and contradiction. It sacrifices resolution for clarity. That's useful until you start treating the compression as the full picture. You forget what was left out. And when you forget what's missing, you lose the ability to notice when it reappears. This makes you vulnerable to change. The environment shifts. Assumptions erode. Variables mutate. But your mental framework doesn't. You're still explaining with yesterday's logic. And the more confident you are in your ability to explain, the slower you are to detect that your explanation no longer applies. That's the price of fluency. It locks you into a narrative that becomes harder to abandon the more clearly you can tell it. This shows up in daily thinking. You tell yourself a story about why someone behaved a certain way. You repeat it. You explain it to others. It makes sense. But the more you tell it, the less likely you are to ask what you didn't see, what you misread, what you wanted to believe. You're explaining a version of events, not the event. This also happens in research. A theory gains traction. It explains a phenomenon cleanly. Scientists begin teaching it, writing about it, structuring experiments around it. But over time, evidence accumulates that doesn't fit. Instead of revising the model, the field splits. Some double down. Others add patches. Few abandon the explanation entirely because too much has been built on it. The cost of abandoning it is too high, so the noticing stops. The trap gets deeper. Your self-image becomes tied to your ability to explain. You're praised for clarity. You're known for insight. You're respected for knowledge. But knowledge is not static. And if you don't update it, it becomes performance. You keep explaining, but the world you're describing has moved on. So how do you escape? Shift the metric. Instead of measuring how well you explain, measure how often you revise. Look for friction. If every conversation feels smooth, you're not being challenged. You're repeating. Second, invert your process. Before expressing a thought, ask, what am I missing? What doesn't fit? What haven't I considered? This interrupts the fluency and restores awareness. Third, create space between learning and explaining. Delay the impulse to clarify. Let information remain uncompressed longer. Let it remain unstable. Don't rush to make it teachable. Make it uncomfortable. And finally, dismantle fluency as identity. If your value is tied to being articulate, you will resist the kind of noticing that disrupts your explanation. Let clarity become a tool, not a trait, because once explanation becomes identity, correction becomes threat. And the better you are at explaining, the harder it becomes to see what your mind stopped seeing long ago. Logic trap number 12. Complexity hides the absence of truth. Complexity is often admired. It's associated with depth, intelligence, and sophistication. A complex idea appears serious. A complex system appears robust. And a complex explanation appears more likely to be true. But complexity is not evidence. It's not verification. It's not truth. It's structure. And structure can be built on nothing. This is the trap. The more complex something is, the harder it becomes to notice that it might be empty. Every layer adds insulation. Every technical term adds distance. Every exception adds ambiguity. And when challenged, the complexity defends itself, not by proving its truth, but by being too difficult to attack. You can't find the flaw, not because it's not there, but because the structure hides it. The smarter the person, the more intricate the complexity becomes. They don't build lies. They build systems. Internally consistent, carefully layered, linguistically impenetrable. The complexity looks like rigor. It feels like insight, but it doesn't need to be grounded in anything. It just needs to hold together. And that's the mistake, mistaking coherence for foundation. An elaborate structure that rests on a flawed assumption is still wrong. It doesn't matter how well it's defended. It doesn't matter how symmetrical it looks. If the first premise is false, every conclusion is fiction, no matter how sophisticated the path to get there. But intelligence resists that. It prefers improvement over abandonment. So instead of challenging the base, the mind keeps building upward. Complexity becomes the fix. Add a clause, add a condition, add a variable. Each addition makes the model more refined and less falsifiable. Eventually, it's so elaborate that no one can challenge it. Not because it's right, but because it's too big to see all at once. This is how dogmas survive. The foundational errors are buried so deep under intellectual sediment that no one remembers where the structure began. The surface is clean, the logic is elegant, but the core is rotten and unreachable. This is especially common in academia, policy, economic theory, and institutional design. A system is built. It's modified over decades. Every inconsistency is managed with more detail. Every anomaly is resolved with a subcategory. And over time, the complexity becomes the proof. Not the data, not the results, the complexity. The logic becomes self-referencing. It must be valid. It accounts for everything. But accounting for everything is not proof. It's camouflage. It hides the absence of explanatory power behind the appearance of completeness. This doesn't feel like deception. It feels like evolution. You're refining. You're adding nuance. You're responding to criticism. But you're never questioning the foundation. And when the foundation is off, every refinement strengthens the illusion. You've made a more precise error. Here's the deeper danger. Complexity lowers the burden of proof. The more complicated something sounds, the less likely people are to demand evidence. They assume it's already been vetted, that someone smarter has verified it. And if they don't understand it, they blame themselves, not the structure. So the complexity goes untested. It becomes a black box. And the less transparent it is, the more trustworthy it appears. Now the structure maintains itself through intimidation, intellectual, linguistic, or institutional. It dares you to challenge it. And when you do, it overwhelms you with details, not to answer your doubt, but to exhaust it. You retreat. You accept. You repeat. You become part of the system, not because you believe in it, but because you can't hold all of it in your head at once. That's the trap. The system wins by outscaling your attention. This also happens at the personal level. Someone explains their worldview in exhaustive terms. Their politics, their ethics, their philosophy. The model is refined. Every objection has a branch. Every contradiction has a clause. It feels airtight, but it's not airtight. It's airless. There's no room for disruption, no space for doubt, no mechanism for collapse. It's not a system seeking truth. It's a system preventing exposure. And when intelligence is used this way, It becomes defense, not exploration. The more skilled you are, the better you become at reinforcing structures that shouldn't exist. You make bad ideas harder to detect. You make false models harder to dismantle. You make yourself harder to challenge. And slowly, you stop noticing that the complexity isn't serving truth. It's replacing it. So how do you escape? Start by questioning the base. What's the original claim this system protects? Not the recent refinements, the first premise. Is it sound? Is it testable? Has it been abandoned under the weight of its own elaboration? Second, reduce the model. Strip away the exceptions, the technicalities, the qualifiers. What's left? Is it still true? Or is it only defensible when dressed in complexity? Third, notice how often complexity deflects inquiry. Does it explain? Or does it distract? Does it clarify? Or does it intimidate? And fourth, examine your reaction to not understanding. If you assume that the flaw is in your mind, not in the argument, you've already surrendered. Because the truth doesn't need to be obscure. And when it becomes obscure, it may no longer be truth. It may just be structure, built on nothing. A masterpiece of engineering that never needed to exist. Logic trap number 13. Being right can make you stop thinking. Being right is supposed to be the reward for thinking clearly. It signals accuracy, insight, sound reasoning, but it also creates a quiet risk. The moment you're right, the mind stops. It relaxes. It concludes. It no longer looks. And that's the trap, because once correctness is achieved, the process that created it becomes less important than the comfort it brings. This is how intelligence gets stranded. You reach the correct conclusion, and instead of continuing to test, refine, or question, you protect it. You internalize it. You build on it. And eventually, you forget that it was ever provisional. It becomes permanent. But no belief, no matter how correct, is immune to context, complexity, or erosion. The smarter you are, the faster this trap appears. Because being right comes easier. You recognize patterns. You follow logic. You filter noise. And once you land on the correct answer, there's little incentive to question it further. Why keep testing what already works? Because environments change. Data shifts. Problems evolve. But once you've stopped thinking, you don't notice. You're still operating inside the framework that once rewarded you. The framework you now protect. Correctness becomes inertia. This is most dangerous when the correctness is public, when others affirm you, when you're rewarded for your insight. Because then, being right isn't just an event, it becomes identity. You're the one who figured it out, the one who got it first, the one people come to for answers. And when your identity is tied to being right, thinking becomes a threat. You stop entertaining possibilities that might disrupt your clarity. You avoid information that contradicts your framework. You dismiss challenges as noise, bias, or irrelevance. Not because you're fragile, because you're invested. This is how reasoning calcifies. It starts flexible, curious, open, but correctness rewards conclusion. And once the conclusion is internalized, flexibility becomes optional. Curiosity fades. Open-mindedness becomes a liability. You already know the answer. Why look again? But knowing the answer is not the same as knowing when the answer no longer applies. That requires re-entry into the uncomfortable state of doubt. It requires reopening the door that being right allowed you to close. And most people, especially smart people, don't want to go back. Because the experience of being right is stabilizing. It reduces mental load. It simplifies decision-making. It gives you an edge. You become more efficient, more persuasive, more confident, but you also become less sensitive. You stop noticing subtle changes. You overlook weak signals. You fail to adjust to noise that doesn't fit your model. And because your model used to be right, you assume it still is. This is how correctness ages into error. It doesn't collapse. It just stops adapting. And eventually, it becomes outdated, not because it was wrong to begin with, but because it was never questioned again. This happens across disciplines. A scientific theory holds. It explains phenomena. It predicts outcomes. But instead of being tested harder over time, it's tested less. It becomes doctrine. And by the time anomalies surface, the model is so embedded that revision feels like destruction. Or a political position proves valid under certain conditions. It works. It solves problems. But once institutionalized, the reasoning behind it is no longer questioned. It's assumed. And when conditions change, the policy lags behind, protected by tradition, habit, and the illusion that it still fits. The same pattern applies to personal beliefs. You go through something. You draw a conclusion. It helps you. It makes you stronger. You share it. You repeat it. But over time, the conclusion no longer fits your current life. Still, you keep applying it because it used to be right, and because others know you for it. You don't want to betray the version of you who needed that answer. So you stay right, even when the context is wrong. This trap grows stronger when intelligence is involved, because smart people can justify staying right. They can dismiss exceptions. They can refine the model instead of replacing it. They can make the answer fit longer than it should. And every time it almost fails but doesn't, they feel reinforced. But that's how systems drift. Not through sudden collapse, but through the slow erosion of relevance. So how do you escape? By removing correctness as a destination. Make it a checkpoint, not a finish line. Let being right trigger more thought, not less. Ask, how long will this remain true? What would need to change for this to no longer work? Second, separate being right from being unchangeable. Let correctness be flexible. Let it move. Don't protect it. Stress test it. Every now and then. Ask, if I were wrong, how would I know? Third, detach identity from insight. Don't be the person who figured it out. Be the person who keeps checking. Don't build your self-image on a past conclusion. Build it on a process that never ends. And fourth, beware of applause. Being affirmed can freeze your thinking, because now the answer is public. And public answers are harder to revise. But revise anyway, because the only thing worse than being wrong is being right once and never thinking again. Logic trap number 14. Clarity ends the search too soon. Clarity is comforting. It feels like resolution. It turns confusion into direction, complexity into narrative, noise into signal. When something becomes clear, the mind relaxes. It stops searching. It stops doubting. It stops questioning. But that's the trap. Because clarity, once achieved, often ends the search prematurely. Not when the truth is found, but when the discomfort disappears. This is not a failure of intelligence. It's a failure of timing. The brain is designed to resolve ambiguity as quickly as possible. Ambiguity is metabolically expensive. It requires attention, memory, uncertainty tolerance. Clarity ends that cost. It feels like arrival. And once arrival is felt, further thought becomes unnecessary. The problem is that clarity can emerge from incomplete information, flawed assumptions, or untested beliefs. It can come too early, but once it's in place, it redefines what you're willing to consider. The moment you feel that something makes sense, your cognitive system locks it in. From that point forward, new data isn't evaluated to find the truth. It's evaluated to confirm the clarity you already have. You don't call it bias. You call it understanding. This is the logic trap. Clarity becomes the standard, not accuracy. If a conclusion brings psychological relief, it's treated as final. If it resolves tension, it becomes correct. The search ends, not because the truth has been found, but because the ambiguity has been closed. This happens faster for smart people. The more skilled you are at synthesis, the sooner you can make complex things feel coherent. You organize faster. You explain more fluently. You reach conclusions others struggle to articulate. But that fluency is deceptive. It hides the fact that you may be simplifying too soon. Premature clarity is often mistaken for insight. The clean narrative, the elegant theory, the symmetrical model, they all feel more correct than the slow, jagged path of uncertainty. But truth isn't always elegant. It's often ugly, partial, and unresolved. And when you reach clarity too quickly, you don't see those parts. You stop looking. Worse, you start defending. You've moved from questioning to affirmation. Every interaction becomes a chance to explain, not examine. Every counterexample becomes a problem to dismiss, not integrate. Your logic works, but only inside the sealed space that your clarity created. And the clearer it feels, the more resistant it becomes to disruption. This is how false models persist. They aren't always held by the ignorant. They're held by the prematurely convinced. The ones who found clarity early and never reopen the question. They appear confident. They appear reasonable. But they're no longer thinking, they're repeating. And because the clarity feels good, it spreads. People want to feel certain. They want a clean explanation. They want the world to make sense. And when someone gives them that sense, they adopt it, not because it's true, but because it ends the search. This is how ideologies grow. Not through terror, through tidiness. A framework that explains everything is seductive, especially when it explains your own confusion. You no longer have to think. You just have to follow the map. But maps are only useful when the territory doesn't change. Clarity is also self-reinforcing. The moment you stop questioning, you start filtering. You unconsciously select information that supports your conclusion. You avoid contradictions. You seek validation, not because you're dishonest, but because clarity wants to remain intact. And the more intact it remains, the more dangerous it becomes. It's no longer tested. It's only expressed. This shows up in science, philosophy, therapy, even self-help. A theory explains human behavior. It works for some. It resonates. It brings insight. But the more clearly it's packaged, the more broadly it's applied. Eventually, it becomes a lens for everything. Not because it fits everything, but because it's easier than uncertainty. And now the search has ended for everyone. But truth doesn't arrive with packaging. It arrives with friction. And when your thinking becomes smooth, you've probably stopped moving. Here's the deeper risk. When clarity becomes identity, change becomes betrayal. If you've taught something, defended it, believed it for years, you're less likely to update it, even when reality demands it. You're not preserving truth. You're preserving self-consistency. And self-consistency is more powerful than evidence. That's why the trap is hard to detect. There's no sharp turn, no loud moment, just a quiet settling. You go from exploring to affirming, from seeking to explaining, from questioning to concluding, and you never notice the moment you stopped. So how do you escape? First, treat clarity as temporary. Every conclusion should be held lightly, no matter how satisfying. Assume that your understanding is partial, incomplete, provisional. Second, expose clarity to noise. Look for what doesn't fit, not to protect the model, but to stretch it, to test it, to see where it breaks. Third, slow down when something makes sense. That moment of insight, pause. Ask, what am I excluding to make this feel true? What am I no longer questioning? And fourth, resist the performance of understanding. Don't rush to explain. Don't make clarity a product to deliver. Let it remain unstable. Let it be interrupted. Because the search doesn't end when clarity appears. That's when the real search begins. Logic trap number 15. The argument replaces the evidence. A strong argument feels like truth. When something is well-structured, logically sound, and convincingly delivered, it creates the sense that the idea it supports must be valid. But this is a flaw in perception, because a good argument is not the same as good evidence. And when the mind begins to treat one as a substitute for the other, reasoning collapses into performance. This is the trap. The strength of an argument becomes a proxy for the strength of the evidence behind it. You stop asking what the claim is based on and start focusing on how well it's defended. The form overshadows the foundation. And once the argument becomes the standard, truth becomes optional. This doesn't begin with dishonesty. It begins with structure. Logic is a system for organizing thought. It tells you what follows from what, but it says nothing about whether the inputs are accurate. You can build perfect conclusions from false premises. And the smarter you are, the easier this becomes. Highly intelligent people are more prone to this trap, not because they ignore evidence, but because they can replace it. They don't need solid data to feel certain. They can build certainty from symmetry, fluency, and rhetorical clarity. And once that certainty sets in, they defend the argument, not the truth. This is especially common in debates, discourse, and intellectual culture. Someone presents a view. It's structured, precise, technically valid. The tone is measured. The language is exact. And the argument stands. But no one asks where it came from. No one checks if the base claim was verified. The surface logic overwhelms the absence underneath it. It feels complete, but it's hollow. This hollowness becomes harder to detect the more convincing the argument becomes. If it anticipates objections, uses clean definitions, and maintains internal consistency, it feels like truth, even if it has no connection to reality. And once you're convinced by the logic, you stop asking for the data. This reversal becomes dangerous when the argument survives on its own, when it's so clean that no one thinks to investigate the assumptions, or when it's so popular that challenging it feels contrarian or disrespectful. The argument gains immunity, not by being true, but by being elegant. And elegance does not require evidence. The trap deepens when the argument is emotionally satisfying. If it supports what you already believe, confirms your worldview, or helps you win a debate, you want it to be true. So you don't test it. You use it. You circulate it. You defend it. And in defending it, you reinforce it. You rehearse it. You sharpen it. You memorize it. Until it feels like a fact. But it's not a fact. It's a frame. And once the frame becomes more visible than the content, the original claim no longer matters. You've replaced investigation with persuasion. And persuasion only needs to feel right, not be right. This happens in ideology. A belief system produces arguments. Those arguments are repeated, refined, formalized. They become talking points, defenses, strategies, and over time, they're treated as proof. But there's no evidence, just patterns of language, moving in circles. This also happens in personal thought. You experience something. You form a belief. Later, you explain that belief. You build an argument. You refine it. And eventually, you no longer remember the experience. You remember the argument. It replaces the memory. It becomes the justification. Even if the experience didn't fully support the belief, you've built the scaffolding. And that scaffolding is now your structure of reasoning. The argument replaces the event. This dynamic is hard to interrupt because it doesn't feel like a failure. It feels like progress. The more structured your explanation becomes, the more legitimate your belief feels. You don't notice that it's untethered from observation. You're not using logic to reveal truth. You're using logic to preserve position. And you call that intelligence. This isn't deception. It's substitution. You've swapped the pursuit of truth for the demonstration of coherence. You've stopped validating your ideas and started displaying them. You're not asking, is this real? You're asking, can I defend this well? And if you can, you believe it. This trap is worsened by culture. We reward fluency. We reward persuasion. We reward clarity. We don't reward humility, uncertainty, or admission of incomplete data. So people optimize for expression, not investigation. And over time, investigation disappears. The ideas that survive aren't the ones with the most support. They're the ones with the strongest architecture. That's how systems drift. They build towers of argumentation on top of absent foundations. And because each floor is sound, no one asks about the ground it stands on until it collapses. So how do you escape? Start by refusing to equate structure with substance. A good argument is not good evidence. It's just a tool for working with whatever you feed it. Second, go backward. When you hear or build a strong argument, trace it to its origin. What's the initial claim? What supports it? Has it been tested? Or is it just the beginning of a well-defended loop? Third, be suspicious of fluency. The smoother the explanation, the more likely it's been rehearsed. Ask, is this logic serving truth, or just performance? Fourth, test your own reasoning. Take one of your strongest beliefs and strip away the argument. What's left? Is there still evidence? Or have you mistaken the elegance of your defense for the legitimacy of your position? Truth doesn't depend on the strength of your argument. It depends on what the argument is made from. Because when the evidence is gone, and the logic still holds, you've stopped thinking. You're just presenting. Logic trap number 16. Your mind solves the problem before it understands it. The brain is built for efficiency. It does not wait for full information. It does not hold uncertainty longer than necessary. When presented with a problem, it begins resolving it immediately, automatically, and often unconsciously. This creates a sensation of clarity long before comprehension is complete. The trap is simple. Your mind doesn't wait to understand. It begins to solve. You don't notice this process because it feels like insight. You read a question, hear a dilemma, face a contradiction, and the mind generates direction. It offers a solution, a framework, a likely answer, not because the problem is understood, but because the feeling of resolution is stronger than the discomfort of delay. This is the logic trap. The sensation of forward movement replaces the discipline of analysis. You assume you're engaging with the problem, when in fact you're exiting it. You don't stay with the ambiguity. You override it. You trade comprehension for momentum, and you call that intelligence. This is not always a flaw. In low-stakes environments, heuristic thinking is efficient. It spares time and energy. But when the problem is novel, complex, or layered, the premature solution becomes an obstruction. It locks the frame. It limits perception. You only see what confirms your quick interpretation, and everything else becomes noise. Now you're not analyzing. You're filtering. The smarter you are, the faster this happens. Intelligence enables rapid synthesis. It turns fragments into patterns. It detects symmetry in chaos. But pattern recognition is not the same as comprehension. You might recognize a structure that isn't there. You might overlay a familiar frame onto a problem that doesn't belong to it. And once that happens, your mind is no longer examining. It's completing. It's closing. You mistake speed for depth. This is especially common in environments that reward certainty, academia, leadership, strategy, public communication. You're expected to act quickly, to form a view, to decide, to respond. And the better you are at doing this, the more often you are praised for it. So you stop asking whether the problem was even real, whether the question was framed correctly, whether the issue required immediate solution or prolonged inspection. The longer you remain successful, the more automated the solving becomes. Eventually, the solving precedes the seeing. Your mind begins to retrofit interpretations to match conclusions already chosen. You believe you're being logical, but what you're actually doing is justifying, not exploring. The original complexity is never returned to. The framing is never re-examined. The intuition is never interrupted. The problem has already been processed, and the mental file is closed. That closure becomes dangerous when the problem is misunderstood from the start. You're solving a version of the issue that never existed. This happens in medicine, economics, education, and ethics. A situation is observed, a pattern is assumed, a solution is deployed, but the original problem was poorly defined. The data was partial. The context was ignored. Still, action is taken. Structures are built. Policies are enforced. Because once the mind has solved something, it's committed, even when it never understood the actual problem. This also shows up in personal life. A conflict arises. You interpret the cause. You assign blame. You respond. But your interpretation may have been emotional, partial, or biased. Still, once a mental conclusion is reached, the behavior follows, and the window to understand what actually happened closes. You're not reasoning. You're reacting from an internal solution already formed. This trap is subtle because the mental sensation is positive. It feels like control. It feels like decisiveness. It feels like mastery. But it's reflex dressed as logic. And when intelligence powers the reflex, it becomes bulletproof. No further examination occurs. You already get it. You already see it. You already figured it out. So you move on. But the unexamined error remains beneath the surface. It grows stronger with every action based on it. And by the time it's revealed, it's been multiplied through decisions, systems, and beliefs. The mind didn't fail to reach a solution. It succeeded at solving the wrong thing. So how do you escape? Slow down the solution reflex. When presented with a problem, don't ask, "What's the answer?" Ask, "Do I even understand the question?" Challenge the framing. Ask what's missing. Ask who defined the terms. Second, notice your internal click of comprehension. When something makes sense quickly, pause. That feeling might be logic, or it might be premature resolution. Ask, what did I just accept without testing? Third, separate reaction from reflection. Just because your brain generated a direction doesn't mean it's correct. Learn to sit in the discomfort of incomplete patterns. Train yourself to delay closure. Insight often lives on the far side of that discomfort. Fourth, examine what the solution is protecting. Sometimes, the urge to solve is not about the problem. It's about defending identity, ego, or emotional stability. Ask, what am I trying not to feel right now? Because not every problem needs an answer. Some need to be held. Some need to be unasked. And some need to be seen more fully before anything else is done. If your intelligence is always solving, it might be the thing stopping you from ever understanding. Logic trap number 17. Coherence makes false ideas feel true. A coherent idea is internally consistent. Its pieces align. The language flows. The logic tracks. When something is coherent, it feels stable, like it fits together. That sensation is powerful. It produces confidence. It generates agreement. But coherence is not a test of truth. It's a test of structure. And structure can be built around anything. This is the trap. Coherence makes false ideas feel true. Once an idea fits together in your mind, it stops feeling suspicious. You no longer look for external confirmation. You no longer test against reality. The internal symmetry becomes its own evidence. And that is enough for most people to believe. This process doesn't begin with deception. It begins with organization. The brain doesn't demand that information be correct. It demands that it makes sense, that it doesn't conflict, that it flows. So when an idea is presented coherently, it slips past the filters. The brain relaxes. The tension dissolves. Understanding has been achieved, regardless of whether the content is accurate. This is how intelligent people get trapped. They're better at creating coherence. They can resolve contradictions, align concepts, find metaphors, fill gaps, reframe ambiguities. The mind turns noise into symmetry. And once that symmetry is constructed, the content hardens. It feels real, not because it's been verified, but because it's been shaped. This shaping is often invisible. You hear a belief that resonates. You adopt it. You hear a second piece of information that aligns. You connect it. You read something else that fits. You incorporate it. Soon, there's a framework. It hangs together. It has rhythm. And because of that rhythm, you assume it must be grounded. But the coherence is artificial. It's been curated, not discovered. You've built something that feels real, not because it reflects the world, but because it reflects itself. This internal consistency becomes self-reinforcing. Every time the idea works in your reasoning, it becomes more trustworthy. You use it to interpret new data. You apply it to new problems. And every time it fits, your confidence increases. But fitting is not proof. You can fit anything if you adjust the frame enough. The danger intensifies when the coherence is social. A belief that makes sense to others becomes reinforced. You explain it, and people nod. They understand. They repeat it back. Now the idea has fluency across minds. That fluency makes it feel even more valid. But again, what's been validated is the coherence, not the truth. This is especially common in ideology. Political, religious, philosophical systems, they all offer internal symmetry. Once accepted, they explain everything. Every contradiction can be absorbed. Every challenge can be reinterpreted. And the more internally consistent the worldview, the harder it becomes to question its foundation, because it never breaks inside itself, even when it's built on false premises, selective data, or outright fiction. This is also common in pseudoscience. A theory might be wrong, but if it's well-structured, explained clearly, and internally consistent, it will spread. People will believe it, not because of the evidence, but because of the coherence. They can repeat it, teach it, defend it. The argument sounds better than the reality it's trying to describe. The same applies in personal reasoning. You form a belief about someone's character. Then you notice behaviors that match. You interpret neutral actions through that lens. Soon, every interaction becomes another piece of evidence. You're not observing, you're confirming. The idea holds together. So you never question if it was flawed to begin with. The trap tightens when coherence becomes identity, when you're known for your clarity, when your ideas are praised for being elegant, persuasive, or insightful. You start valuing the coherence itself. You build more around it. You sharpen the angles, remove the mess, hide the noise. But in doing so, you're no longer engaging with reality. You're polishing a simulation, one that runs smoothly, sounds convincing, and explains nothing. So how do you escape? Start by mistrusting ease. If something fits too well, too soon pause. Ask what's missing. Ask what was excluded to make it coherent. Second, challenge internal harmony. Take a belief you hold and deliberately search for evidence that breaks its symmetry. If you can't find any, the belief is too insulated. It's become self-reinforcing. Third, separate feeling from proof. Coherence feels good. It feels like truth. But truth doesn't always feel clean. Sometimes it's jagged, contradictory, unresolved. If everything lines up perfectly, you might be looking at a system, not a fact. And finally, allow disruption. Let new information break the shape of your ideas. Let it ruin your narratives. Let it fracture what was once smooth. Because if your mind only builds coherence, it will believe anything that doesn't fall apart, even if it was never true. Logic trap number 18. When logic wins, truth can still lose. Winning an argument is not the same as being right, and building a valid chain of reasoning is not the same as finding the truth. Logic is a method. It follows from assumptions, draws connections, eliminates contradictions, but it does not validate the starting point. It does not fact-check the content, and it does not measure the gap between a convincing conclusion and an accurate one. This is the trap. Logic can win while truth loses. You can follow all the rules of reasoning and still arrive at an outcome that doesn't reflect reality. Because logic is neutral. It doesn't care what it's applied to. It's a tool for structure, not a detector for accuracy. You can win a debate, dominate a conversation, or build a complete theory using logic alone. And none of that guarantees correctness. What it guarantees is consistency. Internal, self-referencing, closed-loop consistency. That is what logic defends. If your premises are flawed, your conclusion can still be perfect by logical standards. It just won't be true. This is not a weakness of logic. It's a weakness in how it's used. When you treat logic as truth, you make it serve something it was never designed to do. Logic preserves form. Truth depends on content. When you conflate the two, the most confident thinker becomes the most dangerous, not because they lie, but because they reason from untested ground. This risk increases with intelligence. The smarter the mind, the more power it has to manipulate coherence. A brilliant person can defend almost anything with logic. They can justify, rationalize, counter every objection. They can create a world where their view is airtight. But airtight is not the same as accurate. It's just sealed. This happens in institutions, legal systems, academic circles, and bureaucracies all value logical argument. A decision that can be defended is treated as valid. A policy that follows precedent is treated as fair. But if the foundation is biased or broken, the logic doesn't correct it. It protects it. You can construct entire systems where everything makes sense and nothing is real. This is how harmful practices become normalized, how unethical ideas get codified, how exploitation becomes justifiable. The logic works. The framework holds. The system appears rational. But the truth, buried under layers of reasoning, disappears. You can't see the lie because it's been logically dressed. This happens at the personal level too. Someone treats you unfairly. They explain it logically. They were responding to your behavior. They had no choice. They acted based on the facts. It all makes sense. You can't find the flaw, but it still feels wrong. That feeling isn't irrational. It's detection. It's noticing the space where truth should be, but isn't. It's the recognition that logic has been used to obscure something, not reveal it. This trap deepens when logic is public. In argument, clarity wins. Structure wins. Calm articulation wins. But winning is not discovery. It's persuasion. The better you argue, the more others believe you. The more they believe you, the more you believe yourself. And the circle closes. You're rewarded for performance, not investigation. This feedback loop reinforces the illusion that logic and truth are synonymous. And once that illusion sets in, any challenge to your reasoning feels like a challenge to reason itself. You become uncorrectable. And the more skilled you are at arguing, the more dangerous that uncorrectability becomes. This is how ideologies defend themselves. They don't just preach. They argue. They create airtight logics, moral justifications, economic models, legal codes. And once those are in place, the beliefs inside them become protected, not because they're true, but because they're logical. Even when the logic is defending cruelty, even when the logic is built on silence. So how do you escape? Start by separating form from content. Ask, is the argument valid? Then ask, is the foundation true? Don't let structure blind you to substance. Second, don't confuse persuasion with reality. The person who sounds most logical is not always the one who's right. They may simply be the one with more practice shaping thought into arguments. Third, look for what the logic avoids. Every argument has blind spots by design. Logic filters out what doesn't fit. Pay attention to what's left out, not just what's laid out. Fourth, test for feedback resistance. If a belief cannot be revised, no matter how logical it sounds, it's likely insulated, not stable. And stability without flexibility is just self-protection. Truth doesn't always look logical. And logic doesn't always reveal truth. Sometimes, when logic wins, reality quietly loses. Logic trap number 19. Knowing more justifies seeing less. Knowledge accumulates. That's what it does. With each book read, each theory understood, each pattern recognized, knowledge grows in density. This accumulation brings with it the illusion of completeness. The more you know, the more the world seems to make sense. Eventually, you start to believe that the unseen doesn't need to be seen because you've already absorbed enough to navigate reality. But here's where the trap begins. The more you know, the less you feel compelled to look. You stop observing in real time. You stop listening without anticipation. You stop noticing what's unfamiliar because your brain has already filled in the gaps with what it knows. You're not ignoring new data on purpose. You simply don't register it. Your knowledge system blocks it before it reaches conscious inspection. This filtering is efficient. It saves time. It feels intelligent, but it's also silent, automatic, and extremely difficult to notice while it's happening. Over time, what you know turns into what you see, and what you no longer see begins to quietly slip out of your reality. You don't lose awareness all at once. It decays in increments. Knowledge functions like a cognitive lens. It sharpens what it recognizes. It blurs what it doesn't. With enough experience, the mind stops asking if the lens is correct. It assumes its relevance and adapts everything it perceives to fit inside it. You begin to assume that patterns you've seen before are still occurring. You begin to think you've already seen the whole picture, because you've seen enough parts of it to predict the rest. But prediction isn't perception, and inference isn't attention. This is how intelligent people become blind. Not because they're lacking awareness, but because their awareness is trapped inside the boundaries of their knowledge. They see clearly within the framework they've built, but they don't look beyond it. Not because they can't, but because they don't think they need to. This trap is made worse by fluency. The more effortlessly you can explain, organize, and contextualize what you know, the more confident you become that what you're explaining is sufficient. But fluency is a rehearsal, not a verification. You're repeating what you've already internalized, not verifying whether it still matches what's out there. The more fluent the mind becomes, the more it stops listening. Imagine someone who's studied human behavior for decades. They walk into a room and assume they can read the dynamics instantly. They've seen this before. They've taught about it. They've written about it. So when something doesn't fit their model, they dismiss it or reinterpret it to match the model. Their past knowledge becomes the justification for present blindness. They're not curious anymore. They're certain. This shows up in teaching. A professor delivers the same lecture for years. It's sharp, coherent, insightful. But when a student raises a new kind of question, one that falls outside the lecture's logic, it's brushed aside. The model doesn't need to be updated. The professor thinks. The question just doesn't matter. But what's really happening is that the knowledge has become an anchor, a boundary. The very thing that once created clarity now prevents growth. Or take someone who's skilled in argument. Their ability to use logic becomes so strong that they can justify any belief they've held for a long time. And because their argument makes sense, they stop checking the belief itself. They defend what they know instead of reassessing whether it's still worth defending. The same thing happens in systems. Bureaucracies operate on accumulated knowledge. Procedures, protocols, handbooks, all written based on what was once true. Over time, they stop adapting, not because new information isn't available, but because no one feels the need to look for it. What already exists is assumed to be enough. And so, old knowledge silently replaces the need for fresh observation. It's not that these systems forget how to learn. They just don't feel the urgency to. Now, think about this at the level of personal relationships. You know your partner, your parent, your friend. You know how they act, what they believe, how they respond, or so you think. You stop noticing subtle changes. You stop asking fresh questions. You rely on your prior map. You assume that map is still accurate. And when something changes, you either miss it entirely or interpret it through outdated categories. You no longer see the person. You see the version of them that your memory has stabilized. The more you know about someone, the less attention you give them. The mind says, "I've already got this," and attention goes elsewhere. Knowledge becomes a substitution for presence. This trap becomes even deeper when knowledge is tied to identity. When your sense of self is built around being informed, wise, or perceptive, you start protecting your knowledge from revision. You don't want to be the expert who admits they missed something. You don't want to betray the reputation that your accumulated insight has built. So you cling to what you know, not because it's still useful, but because it's part of who you are. And when identity defends knowledge, curiosity dies. This is how thinkers become preachers, how explorers become institutions, how learners become defenders of knowledge that no longer serves them or anyone else. They know too much to remain open, and their expertise becomes the reason they stop learning. So how do you escape this? Start by disrupting your framework. Don't assume your knowledge is invalid, but don't assume it's still relevant either. Ask yourself, regularly, what am I no longer seeing because I think I already know it? Second, revisit what you know with the eyes of a beginner. Take something you're confident about and re-examine it from first principles. Strip away the interpretations. Look at the raw inputs again. Ask if you're still responding to the actual data or to your mental version of it. Third, reintroduce friction. Let yourself engage with people, ideas, and situations that don't fit your current models. If you're never confused, never challenged, never frustrated by what you encounter, you're probably not learning. You're just rehearsing. Fourth, question the automation of your insights. If your reactions are immediate, if your responses are polished, if your judgments feel reflexive, ask, have I stopped noticing? Have I stopped seeing what's actually here? Finally, remember this. Knowing more should expand your vision, not narrow it. It should make you slower to conclude, not quicker. It should increase your awareness, not replace it. Because when knowledge becomes the reason you stop observing, you're not wise. You're blind and efficient at it. Logic trap number 20. Intelligence makes you argue before you think. There's a paradox that intelligent people rarely recognize in themselves. The smarter you are, the faster you can respond. But fast responses are not always thoughtful ones. The ability to articulate a defense, dismantle an objection, or support a position in real time isn't evidence of deep thought. It's evidence of cognitive reflex. You're not thinking more. You're just thinking faster. And this speed, when mistaken for clarity, becomes a trap. Because if you can argue before you've even reflected, you're no longer using intelligence to explore. You're using it to protect. This is the core of the trap. Intelligence creates the illusion that argument equals analysis. That constructing a case means you've evaluated the situation. That being able to explain something means you've understood it. But most arguments aren't built after deep thought. They're built instead of it. This begins quietly. A position is presented to you, an idea, a claim, a belief. Your mind reacts. Almost instantly, you find reasons for or against it. You hear yourself thinking through consequences, finding examples, drawing analogies. But what's actually happening is less reflective than it feels. Your brain is scanning memory, not interrogating assumptions. You're building scaffolding around a reaction, not examining its validity. And once the scaffolding is up, it starts to look like a conclusion. You tell yourself you've thought it through. But all you've really done is arranged your thoughts in a way that supports your instinctive response. You're not questioning the impulse. You're explaining it. This mechanism is more common among the intelligent. High cognitive ability reduces the friction between emotion and argument. You feel something, and within seconds, You've built a structure that makes it seem logical. The more articulate you are, the more convincingly you can express that structure to others and to yourself. So the sequence becomes reversed. You don't think, then argue. You argue, and then retroactively call it thinking. This habit becomes dangerous when it hardens. When every new situation is met with immediate interpretation. When every challenge is responded to, not considered. When silence becomes a weakness, and hesitation feels like failure. In that state, intelligence stops being a tool for learning. It becomes a shield. You enter conversations to win, not to revise. You listen only to prepare your next statement. You interrupt not because you disagree, but because you've already decided what needs to be said. This is how debate culture corrodes reasoning. Not because people are illogical, but because they confuse arguing well with knowing well. The person with the fastest rebuttal is assumed to be the most informed, but they might just be the most reactive. They're rehearsing reflex, not pursuing truth. This problem intensifies in social or professional settings. When intelligence is rewarded, visibility becomes more important than revision. You want to be the one with the best take, the sharpest comment, the cleverest angle. And once your identity is tied to that performance, you stop questioning whether the argument was necessary at all. You're no longer asking, is this true? You're asking, does this hold up under pressure? And as long as it does, you move on. But holding up is not the same as being right. It's just survival under scrutiny. This trap also poisons relationships. In personal conflict, intelligent people often reach for arguments before they understand emotions. They respond to vulnerability with analysis. They meet discomfort with logic. They turn moments of ambiguity into debates just because they can. But what's being expressed in those moments isn't a question. It's a need. And by treating it as a flaw in reasoning, the intelligent person bypasses the opportunity to connect. They win the point and lose the relationship. In their need to explain, they forget to understand. The tragedy is that they believe they've handled the situation with skill. They were calm. They were composed. Their logic was airtight. But what they missed entirely was the layer beneath the argument. The reality that wasn't asking to be analyzed, just heard. This pattern becomes especially rigid when people praise you for it. When they admire your clarity, your quick thinking, your rhetorical precision. You start to internalize that being intelligent means always having something to say. That being silent, slow, or unsure is somehow a betrayal of your potential. So you perform certainty. You argue automatically. You defend instinctively. You explain prematurely. You think aloud, not to refine your ideas, but to maintain your role. And that's where the real damage begins. Because now, every conversation is shaped by the need to respond, not to understand. Every disagreement becomes a threat to control, not an invitation to curiosity. You begin to use intelligence to suppress learning. Because when you always have an argument ready, you never have to face the discomfort of not knowing. So how do you escape? You start by interrupting the reflex. When you feel the urge to respond quickly, don't. Delay the reaction. Notice the impulse to explain or defend. Ask yourself, do I understand this yet? If the answer is no, stay with the question. Second, practice disassembling your arguments. Take something you believe, and instead of sharpening your defense, try weakening it. Look for where it could fall apart. Reverse your logic. Let your mind move in the opposite direction. Not to convert, but to reintroduce friction. Third, redefine what it means to think. Replace speed with depth. Replace precision with reflection. Replace performance with patience. Let intelligence be a tool for slowness, not speed. Fourth, engage with silence. In discussion, allow pauses. Let questions remain unanswered longer. Don't fill the space just because you can. Some of the most honest thinking happens when no one is speaking. And finally, Detach identity from argument. Being able to argue doesn't mean you've thought deeply. It just means you've learned to build quickly. But building without a blueprint is just decoration. And decoration doesn't make something true. If intelligence is real, it should make you slower to conclude, quieter in reaction, and less certain that every thought is worth defending. Because when you argue before you think, you've already stopped thinking. Logic trap number 21. Questions that sound smart but reveal nothing. Not all questions are honest. Some are performances, designed not to seek truth, but to signal intelligence, superiority, or control. These questions don't arise from genuine curiosity. They arise from the desire to appear insightful. And once this shift occurs, from inquiry to display, the question loses its function. It no longer opens doors. It closes them. This is the trap. Some questions sound intelligent, but reveal nothing. They impress, distract, or dominate, but they don't investigate. They give the illusion of depth while remaining structurally shallow. And because they resemble meaningful inquiry, they go unchallenged. The smarter the person, the more susceptible they are to using this form. Because high cognitive ability makes it easy to generate questions that are syntactically complex, semantically ambiguous, and rhetorically sharp. But complexity is not clarity, and ambiguity is not wisdom. You can ask an impressive-sounding question and still learn nothing. And if you do it often enough, you start to believe you're engaging with ideas, when really, you're just rehearsing the aesthetics of thinking. This trap reveals itself in philosophy, academia, and high-level discourse. Someone poses a question like, what if meaning itself is just a byproduct of recursive linguistic framing? The sentence is grammatically sound, full of abstract concepts, and delivered with conviction. But the structure of the question doesn't open a specific line of investigation. It stalls it.no1 asks for clarification, because the form sounds advanced. But nothing is actually being pursued. The question is meant to posture, not progress. This isn't a deliberate deception. It's a side effect of training. The more you practice sounding intelligent, the more fluent you become in performing inquiry. You don't seek answers, you seek impression. And over time, you can't tell the difference. Your thinking becomes theater. This trap also shows up in interviews, classrooms, and strategy meetings. A question is posed that creates the appearance of challenge, without any intent to understand. It might be loaded, leading, circular, or overly vague, but it's spoken with polish. The room pauses, people nod, and the discussion moves on. Nothing was revealed. Nothing was tested. But the question was respected because it felt important. That's the problem. Importance becomes a function of form, not of purpose. If the words are dense enough, or the tone is confident enough, or the syntax is intricate enough, we treat the question as valid, and the person asking it is perceived as insightful, even if the question itself obscures more than it reveals. This dynamic is hard to detect because it feels like rigor. The person asking these questions is often seen as a thinker. They're not dismissed, they're praised. Their peers regard them as the intellectual center of the room. But what's actually happening is status signaling. The question is not a tool. It's a badge, and once the role of smart questioner is established, the person stops seeking clarity. They start seeking complexity. They want to maintain their identity. So they keep asking, but not to uncover, to display. And the questions get worse. They become abstract to the point of detachment. They become recursive, self-referential, unanchored from observable reality. And because their form mimics insight, they become immune to critique. The more confusing they are, the more profound they're assumed to be. Eventually, the entire process becomes self-reinforcing. The individual stops measuring their questions by the knowledge they generate. They measure them by the reactions they provoke. Do people pause? Do they hesitate? Do they feel intimidated? If so, The question is working, regardless of whether it's answerable. This trap grows deeper when intellectual status is at stake. In academic spaces, think tanks, and panels, the person who asks the most complex question is often assumed to be the most intelligent. They're invited back, cited, respected, but they haven't revealed anything. They've just demonstrated control over abstraction. And abstraction, when divorced from application, is often a disguise for emptiness. Here's the core of the problem. The structure of these questions replaces the intent behind them. A real question begins with the desire to understand. A false one begins with the desire to appear as someone who already does. The difference is motive. But that difference is difficult to see from the outside, especially when the question fits the intellectual aesthetic of the environment. So no one challenges it. And the habit continues until the person asking can no longer recognize what a real question sounds like. They've lost the ability to wonder. They only know how to perform the appearance of wonder. This isn't just an individual failing. It's a systemic one. Many institutions reward the ability to talk around a subject more than the ability to investigate it. A student who asks a strange, abstract question is praised for engagement, even if the question leads nowhere. A speaker who poses an unanswerable riddle is considered profound, even if they never clarify their terms. And so we raise thinkers who ask questions that sound smart, feel deep, and produce no insight. The intellectual ecosystem becomes optimized for obscurity, not discovery. So how do you escape? Start by examining the outcome of your questions. Are they helping you learn or helping you signal? Are they leading to answers or halting the conversation? Second, strip the form. Ask the same question in simpler terms. Can it be reduced to something concrete? Can it be clarified, specified, challenged? If not, you may not be asking a question. You may be broadcasting complexity. Third, reattach your questions to reality. Anchor them in observation, in need, in contradiction. Don't ask what sounds impressive. Ask what feels unresolved. Fourth, pause before you speak. Notice the urge to impress. Is the question forming in your mind because you're curious or because you want to be seen? Finally, remember this. Smart questions don't look smart. They uncover. They disrupt. They change the room, not because they intimidate, but because they focus attention on what matters. A good question reshapes the conversation. A bad one just lengthens it. And when your intelligence is used to perform rather than probe, you've built a voice that sounds deep while hiding the fact that nothing is being said. Logic trap number 22. You believe it because you explained it. There's a strange effect that happens when you explain something, especially out loud, especially to someone else. The act of explanation, regardless of its accuracy, begins to solidify the idea in your mind. You don't just communicate a thought, you reinforce it, you anchor it, and the more clearly you explain, the more convinced you become that what you're saying must be true. This is the trap. Explanation becomes internal proof. You begin to believe in your own statements, not because they've been verified, but because they've been expressed. You equate fluency with accuracy. The more coherent your explanation sounds, the more you treat it as reality. And if others nod along, the illusion becomes complete. You're not validating the idea, you're rehearsing it into permanence. This happens silently. You don't think, I just made that up. You think, this makes sense. And then you forget that the only reason it makes sense is because you made it make sense. You shaped the thought, framed it, smoothed it, delivered it with rhythm. And that performance creates the experience of understanding. It doesn't test the idea, it builds a scaffold around it. And once the scaffold is in place, it's easier to climb than to deconstruct. This trap deepens the more intelligent and articulate you are. If you're good at explaining things, you can make almost anything sound logical. You can turn a loose assumption into a structured argument. You can fill in gaps with metaphors. You can reframe inconsistencies as nuance. And because the structure holds, you start treating the content as reliable. But structure is just a container. It doesn't validate what it holds. The mind doesn't resist this because explanation reduces cognitive friction. Once something is verbalized, it becomes easier to retrieve, easier to remember, and easier to use. The mental system prefers fluency, and fluent ideas get preferred, not because they're more accurate, but because they're more available. This is how false beliefs become stable. You explain something once. It feels smooth. You repeat it. It gets cleaner. Someone else hears it. They ask you to explain again. You do it better. Now the idea lives not because it's true, but because it's fluent. And fluency feels like truth. This shows up in personal memory. You describe an event. Maybe you leave out details, exaggerate a point, or frame it for emotional effect. You don't lie, but you shape. Then you repeat that version. And over time, your brain stores the shaped version as the real one. Now, you don't remember the event. You remember the explanation. This also happens in theory. Someone proposes a model. They explain it convincingly. It sounds clear. People understand it. They ask questions. The answers are satisfying. So the model sticks, not because it's been tested, but because it's explainable. That's the error. Explainability becomes a substitute for evidence. If you can talk about it clearly, you assume it must be grounded. But clarity can be constructed around fiction. The language can feel clean even if the logic is built on sand. This is particularly dangerous when the explanation is public. Once you've expressed a belief out loud, especially with conviction, you become invested in it. You've put it out into the world. You've become associated with it. You've defended it. And now, your identity is entangled with your expression. Changing your mind would mean admitting that what you explained, sometimes proudly, was wrong. And the more you explain it, the harder it becomes to revise. You're not protecting the idea anymore. You're protecting the self who spoke it. That's how performance replaces reflection. This trap also thrives in educational and intellectual settings. Students learn how to articulate answers that sound good. Teachers reward clarity. Over time, students learn to prioritize how well they can explain something, not how deeply they've examined it. They're trained to speak before they've truly understood. And when speaking well becomes the goal, thinking gets replaced with delivery. The same happens in organizations. A manager explains a strategy. It sounds rational. It's presented confidently. The logic is clean. The team aligns. But the strategy is flawed. It's just well articulated. And once explained, it becomes policy. Now, no one questions the flaw. The explanation has already become institutional memory. The trap is reinforced by feedback. When someone praises your explanation, you feel validated. You feel seen, respected, intelligent. That emotional reinforcement makes you even more likely to believe what you just said. Because if others accept it, it must be true, right? Not necessarily. They may just be responding to tone, structure, and confidence. You're all mistaking performance for truth. So how do you escape? First, slow down the explanation reflex. When you feel the urge to explain something, pause. Ask yourself, do I actually understand this, or am I just rehearsing my fluency? Second, reverse the direction. Instead of using explanation to build belief, use inquiry to dismantle it. Ask, what am I assuming here? What would contradict this? What am I not saying? Third, expose your ideas to disruption. Don't just repeat them to people who agree. Seek environments where your explanations don't land, where people ask uncomfortable questions, where your fluency is not enough. Fourth, detach your identity from your delivery. You are not your explanation. You can change your mind, even after saying something clearly, publicly, and confidently. That's not failure. That's growth. Finally, remember this: explaining something doesn't make it true. It just makes it familiar. And familiarity, when left untested, becomes fiction. You don't believe because you examined. You believe because you performed. And when the performance becomes too smooth, you stop noticing what was never real to begin with. Logic trap number 23. You don't doubt it because you can predict it. Prediction feels like control. If you can foresee what will happen, you feel safe. If your model anticipates reality, you assume it must be accurate. And if your beliefs help you predict the behavior of people, systems, or outcomes, even occasionally, you start to treat those beliefs as truth. But this is the trap. The ability to predict something does not prove that you understand it. It only proves that your model works, sometimes. And when a model works sometimes, the mind begins to trust it all the time. This is the flaw. Accuracy by coincidence feels the same as accuracy by understanding. If you say something will happen, and it does, you're reinforced. But you don't stop to ask why. You don't ask how much of that prediction was luck, how much was pattern recognition, and how much was based on selective memory. You simply feel right, and that feeling becomes the foundation for certainty. The smarter you are, the easier this trap is to fall into. Intelligence makes it easier to identify patterns, construct predictive models, and anticipate outcomes. And when your predictions are occasionally correct, your mind begins to overgeneralize their validity. The model becomes more than a tool. It becomes the lens through which you interpret reality, not because it's perfect, but because it's validated by sporadic success. This is how superstition forms in otherwise rational minds. A trader adjusts a strategy based on intuition. It works. Once. Twice. Now she trusts it. She calls it pattern recognition. But it's not a tested strategy. It's a fluke wrapped in logic. The moment it works, she stops questioning it. Prediction becomes faith. This trap is intensified by emotional need. When your model gives you the power to anticipate someone's behavior, a partner, a parent, a colleague, you become emotionally attached to it. It protects you. It shields you from uncertainty. And so, every time it's right, your attachment deepens. And every time it's wrong, you reinterpret the result. You don't throw away the model. You make exceptions. You say, they were just tired. It was a one-off. It still mostly fits. The more predictive your model seems, the more you begin ignoring what it misses. You don't notice its blind spots because it still delivers small wins. This is how ideologies grow. Political or philosophical beliefs that predict some social outcomes are treated as globally correct. When an idea helps you forecast certain events, it's elevated from interpretation to explanation. You say, this proves the theory, but it may only prove that part of the theory aligns with a trend. And if you don't re-examine, the trend becomes doctrine. You don't doubt the system because it predicts something. This happens in science too. A theory explains 90% of observed data. It's elegant, predictive. It becomes dominant. But the 10% of unexplained data is ignored, or worse, adjusted to fit, because the predictive power of the model is mistaken for its completeness. And the cost of abandoning prediction is too high. So the anomalies pile up in silence. Here's the deeper danger. The more accurate a model feels, the more you believe it doesn't need to be updated. You begin to think of it as reality itself, not as a tool for navigating reality. You stop testing it. You stop refining it. You stop questioning the conditions under which it works. You just keep applying it because it continues to predict. But prediction is not proof. And accuracy is not understanding. You can predict someone's behavior without understanding their psychology. You can forecast economic trends without grasping the full system. You can anticipate outcomes while being completely wrong about the mechanics. You only realize this when your model finally fails. And by then, it's not just a tool, it's a worldview. So how do you escape? Start by breaking the assumption that predictive success equals truth. When your model works, ask, under what conditions does this hold? What data am I excluding? What would invalidate this? Second, force your model to fail. Seek edge cases. Apply it to scenarios it wasn't designed for. Don't just celebrate when it predicts. Interrogate when it doesn't. Third, separate emotional comfort from logical coherence. Just because a prediction reduces your anxiety doesn't mean it reflects reality. Often, we hold on to predictive models because they make us feel less uncertain, not because they're accurate. Fourth, reframe your thinking. Prediction is utility, not truth. Models are maps, not territories. They help you navigate, but they don't define the terrain. And finally, beware of reinforcement through outcome. Every correct prediction increases your confidence disproportionately. Fight that. Don't ask, was I right? Ask, how many different models could have also predicted this? Because if multiple models could predict the same thing, your correctness means less than you think. In the end, your ability to predict is only as good as your willingness to doubt. Because the moment prediction replaces understanding, you've stopped thinking and started guessing with confidence. Logic trap number 24. You outsmart the problem instead of solving it. When faced with a difficult problem, the ideal response is to examine it carefully, understand its components, identify the cause, and then apply a thoughtful solution. But that's rarely what happens, especially for intelligent people. The smarter the individual, the more likely they are to find shortcuts, not through laziness, but through ingenuity. They don't solve the problem, they bypass it. They reframe it, redefine it, reroute it, and in doing so, they create the illusion of resolution without confronting the issue directly. This is the trap. Intelligence doesn't always resolve complexity, it evades it. You don't fix the system. You navigate around its failure points. You don't change the habit. You rationalize why it's efficient. You don't confront the discomfort. You intellectualize it into abstraction. And because the problem stops interfering, you treat that as success. But absence of interference is not evidence of resolution. It's just silence. This dynamic begins early. The intelligent student who doesn't study but still passes the exam learns that outsmarting the structure is more efficient than engaging with it. They find the loophole, the pattern, the way to anticipate the question format. They don't master the subject, they master the system that measures it. And once that works, there's no reason to change. They aren't rewarded for depth. They're rewarded for fluency. And fluency becomes a mask. This habit carries forward. In adulthood, the same mind is presented with a complex emotional issue. But instead of feeling it, they analyze it. Instead of examining their role, they frame the other person. Instead of pausing to reflect, they talk themselves into cognitive safety. They're not dishonest. They're just efficient. They know how to suppress what needs to be solved by interpreting it until it disappears. This trap thrives in high-performance environments. A problem arises. A clever workaround is implemented. Deadlines are met. Appearances are maintained. But the problem wasn't resolved. It was postponed, or hidden, or absorbed by another layer of process. And each time it happens, the system becomes more fragile. The structure still works, but it's held together by mental tape and linguistic glue. Eventually, no one remembers what the original issue was. They only know how to work around it. This is particularly dangerous in leadership. A smart executive is praised for their adaptability. They're known for finding solutions quickly, but the solutions are patches, clever reroutes, elegant justifications. They keep things moving, but never address the source of dysfunction. And over time, the dysfunction becomes invisible, because the system never breaks loudly. It just decays quietly. The same thing happens at the personal level. A recurring behavior causes problems. Instead of addressing it, the person invents a belief to justify it. I'm just driven. This is how growth looks. I work better under pressure. The explanation allows the behavior to continue. It replaces inspection with narrative. And now, every time the behavior causes stress, it's interpreted as a necessary cost. The belief has outsmarted the need to change. Here's the deeper issue. Intelligence favors resolution. It doesn't like stagnation. When something feels unresolved, the mind doesn't sit with it. It finds a way around it. A shortcut, a workaround, a frame. And once a frame exists, it becomes part of your mental architecture. But that frame may be protecting the problem, not solving it. You create a structure that keeps the discomfort out. You tell yourself it's under control, that it's handled, that it's integrated. But what you've done is minimize the surface tension, not the root cause. You've stabilized the symptom while leaving the condition untouched. This is why high-functioning people burn out without warning. On the outside, everything works, but underneath, nothing has changed. The conflicts haven't been addressed. The needs haven't been met. The emotions haven't been processed. The structure is built to absorb the damage, not resolve it. And intelligence just makes the scaffolding more impressive. So how do you escape? Start by asking whether your solution removed the problem or just allowed you to function around it. Did you resolve the issue or just stop it from interfering? Second, examine how often you reframe discomfort instead of addressing its cause. When something hurts, do you explain it into submission? When something's inefficient, do you justify it instead of changing it? Third, look at the durability of your outcomes. Do your fixes last, or do they require constant maintenance? Cleverness often creates dependency on upkeep. Real solutions reduce that burden. Fourth, pause before interpreting. Let the problem exist before trying to reshape it. Let yourself feel the friction. Let the issue reveal itself without immediate restructuring. And finally, admit this. Being smart makes you faster. But faster isn't always better. Sometimes, solving means slowing down. Sometimes, it means feeling more, not thinking better. Sometimes, it means being less efficient so you can be more honest. Because when you always outsmart the problem, you stop learning what it ever meant to solve it at all. Logic trap number 25. Formal-sounding nonsense is still nonsense. An idea is not true because it sounds true. A sentence is not valid because it is grammatically correct. An argument is not meaningful because it follows the rules of logic. Language can be structured, fluid, and coherent and still contain nothing. Logic can be tight, formal, and elegant and still defend a lie. The structure of a statement is not evidence for the truth of its content. And the more complex, academic, or technical the language, the easier it is to confuse presentation with substance. This is the trap. Once an idea is phrased in formal, intelligent-sounding language, the human mind tends to give it weight. It sounds serious. It sounds rigorous. It sounds deliberate. And that is enough to bypass scrutiny. The form of the idea is treated as a proxy for its quality. But a sentence that obeys the rules of grammar, logic, or rhetoric is not automatically meaningful. It can be internally consistent and completely empty. It can be fluent and still fictional. You can say, the ontological nature of phenomenological persistence relies on intersubjective convergence. The sentence has structure. It's difficult to parse. It sounds intellectual, but it says nothing. It has no verifiable meaning. There is no testable claim. There is no observable anchor. And yet, to many ears, it feels like philosophy, because it uses the language of philosophers. It wears the costume of insight. This is how pseudo-intellectualism spreads. Not through ignorance, but through form. As long as something sounds formal, people assume it's grounded. They defer to it. They quote it. They repeat it, even when they can't explain it. Especially when they can't explain it. The less they understand, the more likely they are to assume the problem is with them. not with the statement. The authority of the sentence is preserved by its incomprehensibility. This is not just a problem of language. It's a failure of cognitive discipline. The mind wants to believe that sophistication equals depth, that if something is hard to understand, it must contain more information. But difficulty is not depth, and opacity is not insight. A dense idea can be legitimate, but density does not prove legitimacy. Smart people fall for this more often than others, not because they lack critical thinking, but because they value complex language. They are trained to appreciate formal reasoning. They are rewarded for fluency, and so they are less likely to challenge ideas that arrive wrapped in intellectual presentation. They don't want to appear unsophisticated. They don't want to ask basic questions. They don't want to seem like they didn't get it. So they nod, and the nonsense survives. This happens in academic writing. A paper filled with jargon, references, and technical constructions is assumed to be serious, even if its thesis is trivial or incoherent. The structure passes peer review. The language earns citations. But no one reads closely. No one tests the claims. Everyone assumes someone else already did. The structure creates a collective suspension of disbelief. This also happens in popular science, where complexity is confused with expertise. A speaker with confident delivery and scientific vocabulary can explain nothing for an hour and still be seen as credible. They say things like quantum fluctuations at the level of consciousness might imply multiversal entanglement in cognition. The sentence is meaningless, but it's dressed as knowledge. And for many listeners, the surface is enough. This is especially dangerous in political language. A policy proposal may be rooted in ideology, assumption, or manipulation, but if it's framed in formal bureaucratic language, it feels neutral. It sounds rational. Terms like operational framework, strategic realignment, and multi-phase deployment architecture are used to hide intent. They say nothing, but they make the speaker sound informed, and sounding informed is often enough. No one wants to admit they don't understand, so the language passes unchallenged. Even worse, people begin repeating it. They borrow the phrases. They internalize the form. Soon, entire discussions are filled with words that mean nothing, statements that pass for insight because no one is willing to slow down and ask, what does that actually mean? This is how institutions collapse into linguistic illusions. Meetings are held where everyone speaks and no one says anything. Reports are written that summarize the absence of change. Documents are signed that confirm alignment on terms that were never defined. And yet everything appears professional. The language has succeeded. But language that cannot be translated into reality is not communication. It's decoration. This trap extends to self-help and psychology. A person talks about cognitive emotional dissonance in identity alignment processes. They are describing internal confusion, but by reframing it in elaborate terms, they avoid contact with the experience itself. They use complexity as a buffer. They intellectualize their discomfort. They transform real problems into abstract ones. And once abstracted, the problems feel less urgent. They no longer have to be solved. They only have to be explained. This is the ultimate function of formal-sounding nonsense. It replaces action. It replaces analysis. It replaces honesty. Instead of doing the work, you present the appearance of work. Instead of confronting reality, you narrate around it. Instead of asking, what is happening, you ask, how can I sound like I understand it? And the moment you prioritize sounding right over seeing clearly, the trap is closed. You no longer think. You format. You no longer question. You recite. This is how ideologies become immune to criticism. They develop internal languages, phrases, constructs. The language protects the belief. Any challenge is reframed as a failure to understand the terms. Critics are dismissed as uninformed. The ideas are defended by their vocabulary. and the vocabulary becomes more important than the truth. Eventually, the group becomes fluent in the language of itself. Members speak in shared symbols. They confirm their alignment through phrasing, and outsiders are ignored, not because they are wrong, but because they do not speak the code. This is not education. It is enclosure. So how do you escape? First, translate everything. If you can't say it in simple language, you don't understand it. If someone else can't explain it clearly, they probably don't either. Complexity can be useful, but if it cannot be unpacked, it is camouflage. Second, demand clarity. Ask what things mean. Force definitions. Don't allow abstract statements to pass without anchoring them in reality. Don't confuse eloquence with substance. Third, challenge authority by simplicity. The more formal a statement sounds, the more aggressively you should strip it down. Ask, what is actually being claimed here? What can be tested? What would falsify it? Fourth, interrogate your own language. Notice when you are speaking to express thought and when you are speaking to display intelligence. If your sentences are built for performance, you are no longer thinking. Finally, remember this: nonsense that wears a suit is still nonsense. Jargon is not a license to lie. Grammar is not truth. Fluency is not wisdom. An idea does not become valid because you dressed it up. It becomes valid because it survived being stripped down. Logic trap number 26. The model is not the mechanism. A model is not a discovery. It is a construct, a tool, a simplification. It is built, not found. It does not emerge from nature. It is imposed onto it. And yet, once a model begins to work, predict, explain, generalize, it becomes easy to confuse it with the thing it represents. The abstraction is mistaken for the phenomenon. The description is mistaken for the system. The map becomes the territory. This is the trap. The more successful the model, the easier it is to forget that it is only a model, not a mechanism, not a truth, just a version of reality, designed to reduce its complexity to something usable. But usability is not fidelity. Simplification is not explanation. And functionality is not fact. You don't need to believe a model to use it. But the moment it starts working, belief slips in unnoticed. The model starts to feel correct. Not just useful, but accurate. And then, eventually, real. It's not. This confusion is not accidental. Models are designed to mimic, to replicate outcomes, to generalize behaviors. And if they succeed at this, they give off the appearance of describing the actual structure of what they represent. But the appearance is manufactured. It's an illusion produced by compression. What looks like understanding is only approximation, and approximations hide what they discard. This is most obvious in scientific modeling. Weather systems, climate projections, disease spread, particle motion, all rely on constructed representations. These models do not replicate what nature is. They simulate what it tends to do. But their inner workings are not the same as the systems they describe. The variables are chosen, the constants are adjusted, the feedback loops are controlled, and then the results are treated as insight. But the model's success only means the assumptions were close enough, not that the mechanism is known. That difference is rarely accounted for. People quote the model as if it proves something about the system itself. They say gravity behaves like this, or the economy responds like this, when what they mean is our current model behaves like this under our current assumptions. But that's not what gets remembered. What gets remembered is the outcome, and the illusion that the outcome came from understanding. But the model does not understand. It just performs. This trap becomes worse in social and psychological domains. Behavioral economics, personality theory, intelligence testing, motivation science, all build models based on observed regularities. They look for patterns, construct categories, assign labels, And then they begin to speak as if those categories and labels are properties of the people themselves. They are not. If a model divides personality into 5 traits, that doesn't mean people come in 5 kinds. It means that 5 dimensions produce a useful approximation under a certain framework. That's it. The brain doesn't know it's an introvert. It doesn't operate using the constructs we assign. The model is ours, and it is always external. But when it explains something convincingly, we act like it reveals what is inside, and we start building systems around that illusion. Tests, classifications, policies, interventions, all based on an architecture that doesn't exist outside the model. This is how education systems get locked into assessment tools that measure what the model values, not what the student understands. It's how hiring practices standardize personality frameworks that explain variance, not essence. It's how therapy protocols are built around diagnostic categories that only exist inside the manuals used to treat them. No one remembers that the model came first, that the reality is more complex, that the mechanism is still unknown. All they remember is that the model worked. And when something works, it's accepted, reified, reinforced, and eventually, invisible. This is where intelligence becomes dangerous. Smart people are better at designing models. They're better at testing, refining, and communicating them. But they're also more susceptible to identifying with them. They believe in their own constructs, because the constructs produce control. They reduce unpredictability. They simplify the task of managing uncertainty. And the human mind rewards anything that reduces uncertainty, even if it's inaccurate. This happens in AI. A model is trained. It outputs results. The results align with expectations. So the model is deployed. But no one understands why it works. No one understands how it works. And soon, it is being used to make decisions that assume the model reflects reality. It doesn't. It just predicts. And prediction is not comprehension. This also happens in economics. A theory explains market behavior. It gets used in policy. Markets shift. The theory adjusts. But the adjustments are based on fit, not on understanding. The theory changes so it keeps working. No one knows why. And no one cares, because the model still outputs usable results. So it's treated as truth. Until it isn't. Until it breaks. And when it breaks, people blame the data, or the conditions, or the context. They don't blame the model, because they forgot it was a model. This is the trap. Once you trust the model, you stop testing the mechanism. And once the mechanism is no longer tested, the model becomes ideology. It's no longer a tool. It's a worldview. And anything that contradicts it is seen as noise, anomaly, or threat. This is how organizations become dogmatic. They build KPIs, dashboards, and processes based on models. And when reality diverges, they blame the inputs, not the assumptions. The structure is assumed to be sound, because it's been working. But what works depends on what you're measuring. And if the measurements are internal to the model, the feedback loop becomes sealed. Now the model isn't just hiding the mechanism, it's replacing it. So how do you escape? First, name the model. Separate it from the system it represents. Say, this is one model of behavior, not this is how people behave. Language matters. It protects the boundary between representation and reality. Second, reintroduce the unknown. Ask, what assumptions does this model make? What variables does it ignore? What happens if it fails? Don't just look at its outputs. Look at what it had to erase to produce them. Third, diversify your tools. Use multiple models for the same phenomenon. When 2 models predict similar things in different ways, that's a signal. When they diverge, that's a warning. Don't collapse them into one. Let the disagreement remind you that the mechanism is still unresolved. Fourth, resist reification. Don't turn categories into identities. Don't turn constructs into causes. Don't confuse naming something with knowing it. And finally, adopt epistemic humility. Models are tools. That's all. They are lenses, not eyes. They help you see, but they are not vision itself. And the more clearly you remember that, the more likely you are to see what they're still failing to show. Logic trap number 27. The structure persuades you to ignore the content. A sentence can be well-formed and still say nothing. An argument can be valid and still be meaningless. A theory can be internally consistent and still be wrong. Structure is not truth. Structure is not insight. Structure is a surface, a shape, a rhythm, a skeleton. And when the structure of an idea is clean, the mind stops questioning what it's made of. It feels correct because it sounds correct. It looks like logic. It behaves like thought. This is the trap. The better something is structured, the less pressure we place on its substance. A statement that follows a recognizable form, thesis, support, conclusion, feels trustworthy. A narrative that begins with a premise and closes with resolution feels complete. But neither form guarantees anything about the truth of what was said. And once the structure feels good, we stop asking whether the content is real. This effect is not accidental. It's a cognitive shortcut. The brain relies on structure to evaluate coherence. When a message is well organized, it's easier to process. It flows. It aligns with expectations. And so we trust it, not because of what it says, but because of how easily it's said. This is how persuasive writing works. It isn't built on revelation. It's built on form. The structure tells your brain, this is what clear ideas look like. And so you stop checking whether the idea is true. You accept the coherence as confirmation. This becomes more pronounced in environments where structure is overvalued. In academia, the ability to produce a well-structured argument is rewarded more than the ability to generate new insight. In corporate communication, slide decks and strategic memos prioritize polish over content. In politics, sound bites win because they obey the structural rules of rhetoric, even when they ignore the facts. Structure becomes a disguise, and people fall for it, especially smart people. Why? Because they know how hard it is to build good structure. And so when they encounter it, they assume it reflects substance. But effort does not equal accuracy. You can spend years polishing a framework that's based on a false assumption. You can design perfect symmetry around a hollow center. Structure gives you the feeling of understanding, but that feeling is just fluency. It's not verification. This is how nonsense survives in intelligent discourse. A poorly supported idea is expressed clearly. It's embedded in a familiar argumentative structure. It references studies, uses transitions, defines terms, and the structure convinces the audience that it must be reasonable. No one interrogates the premises. No one examines the citations. They assume the idea has already been tested, because the structure wouldn't be there otherwise. But structure doesn't require truth. It only requires rules. This is also how cult ideologies take root. The belief system is presented in a clean sequence. It answers basic questions. It has a beginning, middle, and end. It anticipates objections. It rewards agreement. The structure creates a sense of control, of order, of completeness. And that feeling is mistaken for reality. It's not the belief that convinces people. It's the structure the belief is placed in. This trap becomes more dangerous when structure is taught as an endpoint. Students learn how to write essays, craft arguments, deliver presentations, but they're rarely taught how to detect when structure is being used to obscure content. They associate form with insight, so they become fluent in delivery and vulnerable to persuasion. They win debates, but they lose track of what they're saying. This is especially common in professional discourse. A marketing plan is delivered with bullet points, charts, strategic language. The team approves it, not because the ideas are sound, but because the presentation followed the structure of credibility. It looked like a plan. It felt like a proposal. So no one checked the assumptions underneath it. Everyone assumed someone else did. This is how bad ideas enter systems and remain there. They are not questioned at the level of substance. They are accepted at the level of structure. Once something is formatted correctly, it's treated as vetted. This also happens in personal reasoning. You encounter a situation. You feel something. You build an explanation around that feeling. You place the explanation into a known format. This happened, so I did that. They said this, which means they must think that. The structure is sound. The narrative makes sense. So you stop examining whether it's based on anything real. Your brain trusts the shape of the explanation more than the truth of it. Now you're defending a model, not observing a situation. And the more fluent you are in structured expression, the more likely this becomes. You tell the story so well that you forget to ask whether it's still accurate. You can no longer distinguish the memory from the narrative. The trap tightens when the structure starts to feel like safety. Unstructured thoughts feel uncomfortable. Nonlinear explanations feel confusing. And so you reject them, not because they're wrong, but because they violate the form you've learned to trust. You only listen to what fits the shape. Everything else is noise. So how do you escape? First, separate structure from substance. When something is well articulated, pause. Don't ask, is this clear? Ask, is this true? Look at what is being claimed, not just how it's being delivered. Second, strip the structure. Rephrase the idea in crude, simple language. If it still holds, it might be sound. If it collapses, it was only surviving because of the frame. Third, reverse the test. Take an idea you disagree with and place it in your favorite structure. See how persuasive it becomes. Watch how fluency affects your resistance. Realize that structure can be used to carry anything, including things you reject. Fourth, distrust elegance. When something feels too neat, too seamless, too well-framed, become suspicious. Real insight is often jagged, partial, incomplete. If something feels too structured, it may have been shaped to impress, not to reveal. Finally, detach persuasion from precision. You don't need to be convinced just because someone speaks in paragraphs. You don't need to believe something just because it came in the form of an essay. You don't need to trust a conclusion just because it was built in 3 logical steps. Structure is a delivery mechanism, not a truth condition. And the more you forget that, the more likely you are to believe things, not because they're real, but because they arrived in a format you've learned to trust. Logic trap number 28. Repetition makes it feel rational. A belief does not become more valid through repetition. An idea does not become more rational because you've heard it before. Familiarity is not evidence. And yet, when something is repeated, whether a phrase, a theory, or a justification, it begins to feel more reasonable, more structured, more stable. Repetition creates the illusion of rationality by reinforcing cognitive ease. You mistake the fluency of the idea for its accuracy. This is the trap. The more often something is repeated, the more rational it seems, regardless of whether it ever made sense to begin with. You don't believe it because it's coherent. You believe it because it's available. The effort it takes to retrieve the idea decreases, and your mind interprets that reduction in effort as a signal of truth. This is not intuition. It's error. It's a side effect of how memory works. The brain is designed to conserve energy. When it encounters a familiar pattern, it processes it faster. That speed produces a feeling of fluency. Fluency is misread as logic, and logic is mistaken for truth. That's how false ideas survive. They repeat. They circulate. They enter conversation. They become background noise. And over time, they start to sound like common sense. This is how ideology spreads. A slogan is repeated until it loses its edges. Freedom means responsibility. Hard work always pays off. Everything happens for a reason. The sentence is accepted, not because it's been tested, but because it's been rehearsed. It's spoken in meetings, posted online, printed on walls. It becomes invisible and therefore unquestioned. Once the belief reaches saturation, it's no longer treated as a claim. It becomes a baseline. It's no longer subject to logic. It's assumed to be part of the logical framework itself. This mechanism operates beneath awareness. You don't notice the moment you go from hearing something to accepting it. You don't remember when it crossed from language into belief. You don't realize that the feeling of understanding came not from analysis, but from repetition. And once repetition creates that feeling, the trap closes. The idea now defends itself, not with evidence, but with fluency. If someone challenges it, they sound unnatural, confused, new, and new ideas take effort to process. That effort makes them feel incorrect, even when they're true. The more often you've heard something, the more anything that contradicts it will feel like nonsense. This is not a failure of reasoning. It's a failure of calibration. The mind is using ease of recall as a proxy for plausibility. But recall depends on exposure, not logic. You can repeat a lie until the structure of your brain treats it as self-evident. This is how propaganda works. The content doesn't need to be convincing. It just needs to be persistent. The message is distributed across channels, spoken with authority, mirrored by peers, and over time, it stops being heard as argument. It becomes environmental. You stop evaluating it. You absorb it. And now your perception of rationality is anchored to what you've heard the most, not to what you've thought through. This also happens in education. A model is taught early. It's repeated through examples, assessments, classroom dialogue. Students internalize the model, not just as a tool, but as truth. Later, when they encounter contradictory information, they resist it, not because it's irrational, but because it's unfamiliar. The early model feels rational. The alternative feels disorienting. That discomfort is enough to reject it. This is also common in relationships. A story is repeated. She always does this. He never listens. They don't really care. The sentence becomes a habit. The more it's said, the more it replaces observation. You no longer look at the person. You look through the story. And the story feels rational because you've practiced it. Now you're defending a version of someone that might not exist anymore. You're arguing from habit. This trap deepens when you're the one doing the repeating. The more often you explain an idea, the more likely you are to believe it. The act of repetition reinforces confidence, not because new evidence has emerged, but because you're rehearsing fluency. The more comfortable you become saying something, the more difficult it becomes to examine. And if you've said it in front of others, the cost of revision increases. Now you're not just contradicting the idea, you're contradicting your own record. Repetition solidifies the self. And once the belief becomes part of who you are, rationality is no longer part of the equation. Now you're protecting memory, identity, and fluency, not truth. So how do you escape? First, track frequency. When an idea feels obvious, ask how many times you've heard it. Treat familiarity as a red flag, not a green light. If something has been repeated often, don't trust it more. Test it harder. Second, reset the baseline. Expose yourself to alternative framings. Not just counterarguments, but unfamiliar angles. Let your brain become less fluent with what it thinks it knows. Give it friction. Without friction, there is no thinking. Third, stop rehearsing beliefs you haven't reevaluated. If you find yourself saying the same thing, the same way, more than a few times, pause. Ask, have I examined this recently? Or am I repeating it because it's easier than rethinking? Fourth, watch your mouth. Literally. Speak less when certainty is based on comfort. If your confidence is rising with every repetition, stop talking. You're not reinforcing the truth. You're drowning it. Finally, Remember this. Repetition is not a sign that an idea is solid. It's a sign that your mind is becoming lazy. The idea might be true, or it might just be well-worn. And until you separate what you know from what you've heard, your sense of logic will be built on echoes, not insight. Logic trap number 29. Precision is mistaken for depth. Precision is seductive. A sentence that defines its terms carefully, selects exact numbers, and draws clear distinctions feels intelligent. It signals control, mastery, and clarity. The more precise the language, the more serious the idea sounds. The sharper the boundary, the more stable the claim appears. But this is a cognitive illusion. Precision is a quality of language and measurement, not a guarantee of depth, insight, or understanding. This is the trap. The more precise a statement is, the more depth we project onto it. We assume that clear articulation implies comprehensive thought, that small margins imply careful consideration, that definitions imply wisdom, but none of that follows. A statement can be narrowly focused and still be trivial. A distinction can be exact and still be irrelevant. A term can be well-defined and still be detached from reality. Precision makes the idea feel grounded, even when it's hovering above nothing. This is not a rhetorical trick. It's a cognitive effect. The human mind interprets specificity as effort. Effort is interpreted as seriousness. Seriousness is interpreted as validity. It's a chain of associations, none of which require the original content to be meaningful. If someone says, studies show that 72.3% of respondents report a 14% increase in productivity over 6.1 months. It feels more solid than people tend to get more done over time. But the precision doesn't add truth. It adds frictionless consumption. It gives the illusion that the idea has been tested, that the speaker is rigorous, that the concept is trustworthy. But precision can be applied to nonsense. You can measure the wrong thing to 2 decimal places. You can define a useless category with perfect symmetry. You can run statistical tests on variables that were never meaningful. And the more technical it sounds, the less likely people are to question it. This happens in science. A model produces predictions. The parameters are adjusted to fit historical data. The residuals are minimized. The output is expressed in tight intervals with low margins of error. The language is crisp, but no one asks whether the underlying assumptions make sense. They trust the model because its surface is clean. The clarity of the format replaces interrogation of the foundation. This also happens in law. A regulation is written with exact language. Exceptions are carefully stated. Conditions are specified. But the law is based on a flawed moral premise, or designed to reinforce inequity. The precision hides it. The text is so well drafted that people assume it must be fair. The structure misdirects attention. In academia, this trap shows up in writing. A paper is constructed with care. The thesis is narrow. The methods are documented. The terms are defined. But the research question is irrelevant. The insight is minimal. Still, the precision convinces reviewers. The paper gets published because precision is mistaken for contribution. In public speaking, this trap works on audiences. A confident speaker says, the average person makes 35,000 decisions per day. The number is arbitrary. Its source is weak, but it sounds right. People remember it. They repeat it. The specificity locks it in memory. The claim spreads, not because it's accurate, but because it's sharp. This is how pseudoscience operates. The figures are polished. The claims are bounded. The variables are defined. But the theory is hollow. Still, people adopt it because the structure of the claim looks better than the ambiguity of reality. People prefer neatness over uncertainty, even when the neatness is fake. This trap also operates internally. You build an explanation for your own behavior. You define why you did what you did. You assign causes. You articulate the details. And the more clearly you express it, the more you believe it. But the clarity of your explanation doesn't mean the explanation is right. It just means you've practiced it. Precision in articulation reinforces belief, regardless of truth. This happens in group dynamics. A team discusses a problem. One person provides a sharp breakdown of potential causes. They assign percentages, describe processes, outline consequences. Their contribution is well received. But no one stops to ask if the framing is correct. The precision of the response is interpreted as evidence of depth. But it's just a polished version of a guess. This trap strengthens with expertise. Experts are trained to be specific. They're rewarded for clarity. They know how to control variables, define boundaries, and isolate causes. But they can still be wrong. And when they are, their precision becomes a shield. The error becomes harder to detect because the surface is flawless. This is how systems fail without warning. Everyone is precise. Everyone is exact. Everyone is clear. But no one is thinking. No one is asking if the questions matter. No one is rechecking the assumptions. The mechanism is precise, but it's pointed in the wrong direction. So how do you escape? First, decouple clarity from value. Just because something is stated cleanly doesn't mean it's meaningful. A well-worded sentence is not evidence of a real insight. It's just a well-worded sentence. Second, interrogate what is being defined. If a concept is precise, ask, is this precision necessary? Is it useful? Or is it decorative? Third, look for depth underneath the polish. Ask, what problem is this trying to solve? What uncertainty does it reduce? What ambiguity does it address? If the answer is none, then the precision is ornamental. Fourth, beware of false hierarchy. Don't treat highly specific language as superior. Often, the deepest insights are expressed in plain terms. The more someone insists on tiny distinctions, the more you should ask, what are they trying not to say? And finally, remember, precision can hide absence. Sharp language can dull perception. Defined terms can shrink thought. An idea is not deep because it's small. It's deep because it touches something that can't be reduced, even when you try. Logic trap number 30. Arguments are built backwards. Arguments are supposed to be constructed from evidence. A claim is made. Support is gathered. Logic is applied. A conclusion is reached. That's the textbook model. That's what people say they do. But it's not what actually happens. In practice, arguments are often built backwards. The conclusion comes first. Then the justification is assembled around it. The argument is not a path to truth. It's a defense of a position already taken. This is the trap. What looks like reasoning is often rationalization. The structure of an argument is present, premises, steps, conclusions, but its purpose is inverted. It exists to protect the endpoint, not to discover it. And because the logic flows in the correct direction, the reversal goes unnoticed. The surface matches the form of valid reasoning. The content does not. This inversion begins subtly. A person forms an intuition, a reaction, a preference. They feel something. They decide. The conclusion is emotionally anchored. Then the brain begins to build support. It looks for evidence. It filters data. It constructs a narrative. It finds connections. And it does all of this while maintaining the appearance of objectivity. The process is defensive, not investigative, but the structure looks the same. So the person believes they've reasoned their way forward, when in fact they've reasoned in reverse. This is not deception. It's cognition. The brain is not designed to be neutral. It is designed to reduce uncertainty. Conclusions reduce uncertainty. So the faster a conclusion can be reached, the more comfortable the system becomes. And once comfort is achieved, logic becomes a tool of reinforcement. The more intelligent the person, the stronger the reinforcement. Because intelligent people are better at justifying what they already believe. They generate more explanations, more connections, more analogies, And because the explanations are polished, they feel correct. The illusion is complete. This reversal happens everywhere. In political belief, the conclusion comes first. This side is right. Then, the evidence is gathered selectively. The inconsistencies are ignored. The logic is deployed post hoc. The conclusion is never tested again. It becomes an identity. The reasoning is decoration. In moral disputes, the conclusion is often emotional. That's wrong. Then comes the justification. Ethical frameworks are selected to match the feeling. Consequences are inflated or downplayed. Words are chosen to reinforce instinct. The person believes they are principled, but they are reactive and well-practiced at sounding principled. This trap is reinforced socially. In debate, the goal is not discovery. It is victory. The person who defends their position best is considered smarter, stronger, more articulate. Changing your mind is weakness. Hesitation is punished. So everyone picks a side early. Then they reverse engineer their logic. The structure is admired. The inversion is ignored. In personal life, this trap appears in conflict. Someone feels disrespected. Instead of examining the feeling, they construct an argument. You always do this. This proves that. The argument sounds rational, but it exists to defend a pre-existing wound, not to understand what happened. And the more often the argument is repeated, the more permanent the conclusion becomes. The person stops listening. They start rehearsing. The same happens in internal dialogue. You form a belief about yourself. Then you build the argument. I'm not good enough. I always fail at this. I'm the kind of person who can't change. The reasoning is backwards, but the structure looks valid. And once the structure is memorized, it becomes part of your identity. Now the argument defends itself. This trap is harder to detect the more fluent you are in logic. The language of reasoning becomes camouflage. You list reasons. You describe trade-offs. You reference principles. But the goal is not to examine the conclusion. It is to protect it. The logic flows. The content does not. And because it looks like an argument, no one notices the reversal. So how do you escape? First, identify your conclusions. Write them down, the things you're most certain of. Then ask, when did I form this conclusion? What came before it? Did I reason into it? Or have I only reasoned around it? Second, break the direction of thought. Take your conclusion and try to falsify it. Not hypothetically, deliberately. Argue against yourself. Don't protect your belief. Attack it with the same tools you've used to defend it. See if it survives. Third, slow down belief formation. Don't trust your first reaction. Notice it, but do not elevate it. Pause before building justification. Ask, what else could this mean? What would I think if the roles were reversed? Fourth, discard arguments that only serve the conclusion. If your reasoning is there only to confirm what you already believe, it is not reasoning. It is performance. Finally, remember, a conclusion is not a goal. It is a consequence. And if you build backwards, you're not thinking. You're decorating a decision you already made.